What if history wasn't written in facts, but in accidents? What if the universe had a punchline and we're living in it? From presidents with eerie parallels to doomed ships predicted in fiction, the past isn't just strange, it's suspicious. These aren't just coincidences, they're cosmic winks, ghosts in the timeline. So buckle up for 101 of the weirdest, wildest, most unsettling overlaps in human history. Some are funny, some are tragic. All of them unexplained. And once you see the pattern, you won't be able to unsee it. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe. This rabbit hole goes deep, and trust me, you don't want to climb out alone. While you're at it, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Ohio? 3 a.m. in Manila? Let's see how far this web of coincidences really stretches. The unlucky car and the assassination. There are cursed cars. And then there's this one. A dark green Grafe and stiff double phaeton, shining with imperial arrogance on a Sarajevo morning in June 1914. The kind of vehicle that looks like it came with a built-in premonition. It carried Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie, straight into the bullet-stained pages of history. The car didn't just transport royalty, it chauffeured them directly into martyrdom. Parked in a tight street, in front of a wrong turn, it idled just long enough for Gavrilo Princip to step forward, pull a pistol, and execute 2 shots that would shatter empires. But the vehicle's most chilling feature came later, when historians and conspiracy connoisseurs noticed its license plate, a 3118, which, if you squint a littler, more appropriately, look at it. The way a grieving, exhausted, post-war Europe might resembles a date. Armistice Day, the 11th of November, 1918. 11 divided by 11, divided by 18. Coincidence, pattern, or just a sick joke written in iron and blood? Some call it prophetic, others call it nonsense, and some insist that coincidences like this are inevitable when history is cluttered with tragedy. But if that's true, why do so many of the world's most defining moments carry strange shadows in their margin-hidden dates, recycled names, echoed symbols, déjà vu served cold? How does a license plate accidentally tell the future, and why does that idea stick with us more than most textbooks ever could? The car itself was eventually returned to Vienna and exhibited in a museum proudly, awkwardly, like a relic that doesn't know whether it's a crown jewel or a crime scene. It now sits quietly in a museum, stripped of gasoline but still fueled by dread. Because whether or not you believe in signs, it's hard to ignore a metal plate that seems to scream the date the world stopped bleeding. And it's not the only moment history appeared to read ahead in its own script. Just ask the man who wrote about an unsinkable ship that hadn't even been built yet. The Titanic and the novel. In 1898, a little-known writer named Morgan Robertson published a novel titled Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. A cautionary tale of hubris on the high seas, the book detailed the voyage of a state-of-the-art ocean liner, grandly named the Titan, which was declared unsinkable. It struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic and went down. There weren't enough lifeboats. Thousands died. The end. 14 years later, a real ship called the Titanic, in case you missed the subtlety, set out on its maiden voyage. Unsinkable, they said. An iceberg, they said. Not enough lifeboats. Again. It's almost insulting how precisely the universe seemed to plagiarize Robertson's work. The fictional Titan and the real Titanic shared not only similar names and sizes, but eerily parallel circumstances. Both were British, both carried the elite of society, both were sailing in April, both struck icebergs in eerily similar locations, and both did so with a fatal lack of preparation. If Morgan Robertson had been born in the 21st century, someone would have accused him of staging the whole thing for a viral Netflix series. Skeptics argue that Robertson's book simply extrapolated from the naval technology of the time and that any number of imagined disasters might have fit the eventual tragedy. But that's the thing about coincidence, it doesn't need your belief. It just stares back at you from the smoking wreckage with a faint smirk. Robertson didn't claim clairvoyance. He insisted it was just fiction. But fiction has a nasty habit of remembering the future before the present has even caught on. And when it comes to maritime clairvoyance, Titanic wasn't even the last shipwreck to echo a book. But that's another story. Because if ships can be predicted, what about assassinations? The Lincoln-Kennedy coincidences expanded. Let's play a morbid game of presidential symmetry. Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, separated by a century, but apparently linked by a cosmic script editor with a penchant for eerie detail. Lincoln was elected in 1860, Kennedy in 1960. Both were succeeded by men named Johnson, Andrew, and Lyndon, respectively. Both Johnsons were Southern Democrats, and both were born in years ending in 08, 1808, and 1908. The echoes are getting louder. Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theater. Kennedy was shot in a Lincoln made by Ford. Lincoln was shot in the head on a Friday while seated next to his wife. So was Kennedy. Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy who warned him not to go to the theater. Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln who allegedly warned him not to go to Dallas. You can't make this stuff up except, perhaps, that last one. Historians have argued that Kennedy never had a secretary named Lincoln. But why ruin a good story with facts? Both assassins were known by three names, John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald. Both names contain 15 letters. Both assassins were killed before trial. Booth shot Lincoln in a theater and fled to a warehouse. Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse and fled to a theater. It's a Mobius strip of violence, looping endlessly through American mythology. Some say these are coincidences, the byproducts of a pattern-hungry species spinning cosmic order from random chaos. Others nod solemnly and talk about destiny, reincarnation, or the long arm of conspiracy. But perhaps it's simpler than that. Maybe history, like a bored playwright, just plagiarizes itself when the stakes are high enough. And if you think cosmic timing is limited to bullets and ballots, consider a man who predicted not just his own death but the arrival of a celestial visitor. Mark Twain and Halley's Comet. Samuel Langhorne Clemens, better known to posterity as Mark Twain, arrived on Earth in 1835 under the glow of Halley's Comet. And because he had a flair for dramatic exits as well as entrances, he famously predicted that he would go out with the comet as well. "It will be the greatest disappointment of my life," he said, "if I don't go out with Halley's Comet. The Almighty has said, no doubt. Now here are these two unaccountable freaks. They came in together. They must go out together." Spoiler alert. He died the day after the comet's closest approach in 1910. This wasn't just poetic timing, it was cosmic slapstick. Twain, who spent his life skewering human folly, was now part of an astronomical punchline. The comet, a flaming snowball of ice and dust, takes 76 years to orbit the sun. What are the odds that Twain's entire life would be bookended by its blaze? Well, according to statisticians, who cares? The story is better than the math. Of course, skeptics argue that Twain was just playing the odd. She was an old man, the comet was due, and he was always a master of narrative timing. But dying on cue is still a rare talent. And there's something delightfully Twainian about an author who mocked fate for a living, then used it as his curtain call. The real mystery isn't whether the stars care about us. It's whether we care about the stars enough to arrange our lives consciously or not around their indifferent cycles. And if death can ride a comet, what happens when it sneaks in through the papal palace? Ask the men who both wore the same name, but walked very different paths. The last two popes named John Paul. In 1978, the Vatican had a year of celestial turbulence. It began with Pope Paul VI's death and the election of his successor, Albino Luciani, who took the name John Paul I in tribute to his two predecessors. A symbol of continuity, of harmony, of unity. But then the new pope died 33 days later. No illness disclosed, no grand papal gesture fulfilled, just gone. Dead in bed, a quiet Vatican whisper in the middle of the night. Conspiracy theories ignited faster than incense. Poison, politics, divine punishment, or simply a tragic coincidence? The Vatican shrugged. Natural causes, they said, with the conviction of a guilty man offering alibis. Then came John Paul II, the sequel pope, a Polish outsider, the first non-Italian in 455 years. He ruled not for 33 days, but 26 years a reign that saw the Cold War cool, communism crack, and the papacy modernize in unexpected ways. Two popes named John Paul, one a flicker, the other a bonfire. Together, they formed a symbolic palindrome: brief death, long life, silence, voice, mystery, history. And yet the eerie symmetry doesn't stop there. John Paul I's papacy was marked by transparency and reformist ideas. He wanted to clean house. He never got the chance. John Paul II, though charismatic and transformative, also buried some of the church's darkest scandals under years of silence. As if fate had decided that the one who wanted to change things would be silenced, and the one who persevered would carry the weight of unresolved truths. Coincidence? Or ecclesiastical comedy? Divine intervention or bureaucratic malfunction? In the holy halls of the Vatican, where tradition is doctrine and time moves like molasses, even the names of popes seem to play into strange, uncanny narratives. And, speaking of uncanny foresight, how did an animated sitcom predict a presidency before the rest of the world even took it seriously? The Simpsons and Donald Trump's presidency. Cartoons are not supposed to predict the future. They're supposed to mock the present. But The Simpsons, like a yellow-skinned Nostradamus in khakis and a tie, has repeatedly done both. And in 2000, it served up a political gut punch disguised as satire. In the episode Bart to the Future, a grown-up Lisa Simpson becomes president. Her first order of business? Cleaning up the economic ruin left by, President Donald Trump. At the time, it was absurd. Trump had flirted with politics before, sure, but as a punchline, not a possibility. The idea of him leading the free world was laughable, so The Simpsons laughed. Hard. 15 years later, the joke stopped being funny. When Trump descended that golden escalator in 2015 to announce his candidacy, something twisted in the timeline. America collectively blinked. Hadn't we seen this before? The internet resurrected the clip. Headlines screamed, "The Simpsons predicted Trump." Memes bloomed like post-apocalyptic flowers. Skeptics dismissed the prediction as cherry-picking. After all, the show has aired over 700 episodes. Some guesses were bound to stick. But there's a difference between statistical probability and cultural foreshadowing. The Simpsons didn't just mention Trump, it contextualized his presidency as an economic catastrophe. A punchline in a nation's slow descent into farce. And the visual parallels didn't help. Trump waving to fans in eerily identical settings, down to the signs and gestures. The show became a Rorschach test for America's future. Was it just clever satire? Or did it tap into something buried, something collective, something everyone laughed at because it was too terrifying to take seriously? If a cartoon can see the future, maybe it's not seeing at all. Maybe it's just holding a mirror. And if that mirror can reflect a presidency, what happens when it reflects death itself twice, through the same windshield? The twin brothers and the fatal accidents. In Bermuda, sometime in the early 1970s, a taxi driver ran over a man. That alone isn't extraordinary. It's tragic, but not uncommon. But then, A year later, that same taxi driver driving the same cab and killed another pedestrian, also tragic, but still, theoretically possible. Now here's the part where fate decides to flex. The second victim turned out to be the twin brother of the first. Let that sink in. Same driver, same taxi, same street, same fatal impact, same genetic face. If this had been a film script, it would have been rejected as lazy writing. Too implausible, too melodramatic, too perfectly engineered by the cold hands of fate. But reality, unlike screenwriters, doesn't worry about credibility. It just folds time and tragedy like origami. The details only deepen the discomfort. Both twins had eerily similar lives, living in the same neighborhood, riding mopeds, and apparently sharing a penchant for unlucky timing. The cab driver, understandably, was haunted. People speak of curses, of supernatural loops, of déjà vu engineered by a careless universe. Statisticians would mumble about probability, about small populations, limited streets, predictable behavior patterns. But the question isn't, is this possible? The question is, why did it happen this way? Why the same cab? Why the same driver? Why a set of identical twins severed by identical fate? Coincidence doesn't explain the emotional weight of symmetry. It doesn't explain why the second death feels not like a tragedy, but a reenactment. And sometimes, in the theater of life, fate doesn't just echo, it rewinds. If you think music can't play along with fate's eerie rhythm, just try syncing The Wizard of Oz with Pink Floyd. 7 down, 94 to go, and we've barely scratched the surface. If you're still here, you're officially one of us now. Go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this wonderfully cursed list. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it? Are you wide awake in Berlin? Or spiraling at 2 a.m. in Nebraska? Let's map the madness together. The Wizard of Oz and Pink Floyd. It starts with a needle drop and a leap of faith. You take The Wizard of Oz, cue it up without sound, and play Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon in its entirety. The instructions are always the same. Start the album on the third roar of the MGM Lion, then watch, just watch. And suddenly, Judy Garland's steps fall in rhythm with the bass line. Lyrics like "balanced on the biggest wave" drop just as Dorothy balances herself on a fence. The registers at the grocery store beep in sync with the cash register and money, and when the tornado hits, the music swells into eerie chaos. Coincidence, says the band. Every single time, the surviving members have denied intentionality. No secret plan, no grand experiment, no backmasking Illuminati. Just fans with too much time and a penchant for magical thinking. But watch it once, and you'll swear it was real. Not because the synchronicity is perfect, it isn't. Not every moment lines up. But when it does, it really does. And more than that, it feels right. The mood of the music, the arc of the film, the uncanny empathy between visuals and sound. It's as if two separate artistic visions, decades apart, accidentally composed a duet across time. So how do you explain it? Shared archetypes? The rhythm of storytelling? Or is it just that our minds are designed to find patterns, to invent meaning where none exists, to overlay sense on the senseless? Maybe. Probably. But if a psychedelic rock album and a technicolor fable can accidentally compose a cosmic ballet, what else might be echoing in the cultural ether? What other impossible alignments might exist, waiting to be noticed? Maybe they're not fiction. Maybe they're buried in the trenches of warite between the first and last soldiers to die. The first and last British soldiers killed in WWI. World War I was a catastrophe measured in millions. Millions of deaths, millions of miles of trenches, millions of disillusioned dreams. But in that ocean of carnage, two names rise like silent punctuation marks: Private John Parr and Private George Edwin Ellison. Parr was the first British soldier killed in the war, shot during a reconnaissance mission in Belgium in August 1914. Ellison was the last, killed just 90 minutes before the armistice on the 11th of November, 1918. Both died in Belgium. Both were regular soldiers. Both were casualties of orders from men who would never see the mud or the blood. And in a final twist, so symmetrical it borders on satire, they are buried just a few yards apart in the St. Symphorian Military Cemetery. Think about that. 4 years of global slaughter, entire continents reshaped, a generation decimated, and yet the first and last British soldiers to fall ended up resting side by side, as if the war itself wanted to sign off with a neatly tied bow, as if fate, weary of chaos, decided to lay its final two pieces in perfect alignment. Some call it logistical coincidence, there weren't many cemeteries nearby, but others can't help but feel the chill of design, the echo of narrative, the beginning and the end, staring at each other through eternity's silence. War may be random, but memory is not. We need symbols, and so we put these two men together not because they chose it, but because we need to believe their deaths meant something, anything. And speaking of death's strange symmetry, consider the King of Rock and the ghost he never met, but could never escape. Elvis Presley and his twin brother. Elvis Presley entered the world on the 8th of January, 1935, in Tupelo, Mississippi. But he didn't come alone. A few minutes before him, another boy was born. Jesse Garon Presley, stillborn, gone before his first breath. Elvis never spoke much about Jesse in public, but those who knew him really knew him, said he carried that ghost everywhere. It haunted his dreams, shaped his superstitions, lived in the shadows of his fame. The king of rock and roll, the icon of swagger and excess, had a twin-shaped hole in his heart. Some believe Jesse's absence made Elvis feel incomplete, always reaching for a harmony that never quite returned. Others whisper that Jesse was the price of Elvis's destiny-owned life, snuffed out so another could shine. A cosmic trade-off, one heartbeat exchanged for a lifetime of music, addiction, and global adoration. There's even a branch of spiritual belief that says twins born this way form an unbreakable bonding that endures even when only one survives. Some fans think Jesse was Elvis's guardian, or maybe his burden. That somewhere in the madness of Graceland in Vegas, there was always one empty seat. And it's not just romantic fantasy. Elvis's life was a slow dance with duality, gospel and rock, humility and vanity, triumph and tragedy. Perhaps it all began with that moment in the delivery room. 2 brothers, 1 breath. Coincidence? Maybe. But history has a thing for twinning, for doubling down, for echoing itself just enough to make us wonder if we've been here before. And speaking of repeated patterns, what happens when death knocks at the Oval Office every 20 years like clockwork? The curse of Tippecanoe. Every 20 years, from 1840 to 1960, the Oval Office hosted not just a president, but a marked man. It began with William Henry Harrison, the war hero who won the Battle of Tippecanoe and rode his fame into the White House in 1840. He also promptly died of pneumonia just 31 days into his presidency. Harsh start. Then came Lincoln, elected in 1860. Shot Garfield in 1880. Shot McKinley, 1900. Shot Harding, 1920. Heart attack. FDR, 1940. Cerebral hemorrhage. And JFK, 1960. Shot. Again. All presidents elected in years ending in 0. All dead before completing their terms. Coincidence or curse? They called it the curse of Tippecanoe, or the 0-year curse. As if Harrison had angered some unseen force at Tippecanoe in 1811 that decided to schedule presidential deaths like recurring calendar alerts. Native American leaders were said to have cursed Harrison after the battle, though the details are murky. The legend was convenient. America loves its poetic justice, even when it's manufactured in hindsight. Ronald Reagan broke the pattern in 1980 barely. He was shot in an assassination attempt but survived. George W. Bush, elected in 2000, also made it through. Has the curse lifted? Or did it just hit snooze? Patterns like this demand belief. The math is simple but seductive. 6 presidents, 120 years, same fatal rhythm. You can dismiss it as selective data. What about other presidents? Other years? But the human brain craves symmetry, and death on a schedule is the most dramatic symmetry of all. And if death can be scheduled, can it also be celebratory? Because our next mystery involves a Roman emperor who couldn't even be bothered to wait a day apart for his birth and demise. The Roman emperor who died on his birthday. Julian the Apostate. Now that's a name. A Roman emperor with the vibe of a failed philosopher and the tragic arc of a Shakespearean anti-hero. He reigned for a brief and turbulent period in the 4th century, tried to bring back paganism, and openly mocked Christianity with a sarcasm that would have made Voltaire blush. He wasn't exactly subtle about it either. According to some ancient sources, Julian was born on the 26th of June, 331 AD and died on the 26th of June, 363 AD. Same day, same month, different year. You can almost hear the cosmic drumroll. He was fatally wounded in a Persian campaign, struck in the abdomen by a spear during a skirmish. There's a poetic tension in the idea of dying on your birthday, a grim bookend. It completes a circle. It turns your life into a closed loop. You exit stage left exactly as you entered. For Julian, the man who tried to reverse an empire's spiritual course, it feels almost symbolic, like the gods were reclaiming their advocate before he overstayed his welcome. Skeptics point out that ancient birth dates are notoriously fuzzy. Records were imprecise, calendars changed, scribes lied or guessed. So maybe it's not literally true, but that misses the point. Whether or not Julian truly died on his birthday, the belief that he did has power. It adds a mythic weight to his already strange legacy. Dying on your birthday, it's rare, but not unheard of. Still, when it happens to someone like Julian, it feels less like coincidence and more like choreography. But not all disasters are cosmic. Some are purely mechanical. Like a bridge, for example, that danced itself to death in full view of humanity. The unlucky bridge. It was supposed to be an architectural marvel, sleek, elegant, a symbol of progress strung across the Puget Sound in Washington state. Instead, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge became a masterclass in catastrophic overconfidence. They called it Galloping Gertie even before it collapsed. The year was 1940. Engineers had built the suspension bridge with long, slender spans to minimize cost. Unfortunately, they also minimized stability. When wind funneled through the Narrows, the bridge didn't just shake, it twisted, bucked, groaned, like it was possessed by a poltergeist with a flair for interpretive dance. The footage is infamous now, the deck rippling like a ribbon in the wind, cars trapped mid-span, a man trying desperately to rescue his dog. Minutes later, the bridge snapped apart and crashed into the water, taking Gertie's sleek promises with it. No lives were lost except the dog, but the psychological damage was permanent. Engineers were stunned. Nature had humiliated them in public. The cause? Aeroelastic flutter. A phenomenon poorly understood at the time, but now a textbook example in every structural engineering course. The coincidence here isn't just that a bridge could collapse due to wind, it's that such a dramatic failure occurred within months of the bridge opening. 1 billion calculations, years of planning, and yet Gertie was doomed from the start. All it took was the right breeze to expose the flaw. And so, Galloping Gertie became an icon of human arrogance, our tendency to believe we can outthink nature until she decides to dance. And speaking of icons, what happens when a single actor becomes the embodiment of darkness and deduction? The actor who played both Dracula and Sherlock Holmes's brother. Sir Christopher Lee was not an ordinary actor. He was more of a myth wrapped in a cape, delivered in baritone. He played Count Dracula no fewer than 10 times, sinking his teeth into the role until he became its cinematic shadow. But what people often forget is that he also portrayed Mycroft Holmesius, Sherlock's cold, calculating older brother, in the private life of Sherlock Holmes no less. On paper it seems like nothing, an actor taking 2 very different roles across very different genres. But look closer. Christopher Lee didn't just play them, he embodied them. He was the undead aristocrat, and then the intellectual puppeteer behind Britain's most famous detective. Both characters distant, detached, menacing in their own quiet ways. And both anchored by a strange duality. They exist on the periphery of reason. One uses logic to manipulate, the other defies logic altogether. Lee's filmography reads like a greatest hits list of Western folklore's most enduring nightmares. Dracula, Saruman, Count Dooku, Death himself. His face became synonymous with mystery, menace, and sometimes misunderstood morality. That he also stepped into the shoes of Mycroft, a figure known for being even more brilliant and more enigmatic than Sherlock, feels less like casting and more like cosmic typecasting. Coincidence? Or was Lee simply orbiting a constellation of roles designed to echo the same archetype? The man who sees more than he should and reveals less than he knows. In a way, Lee didn't just portray these characters. He collapsed them. The supernatural and the supremely rational, housed in the same towering frame. And if Christopher Lee was a nexus of characters with unlikely overlaps, wait until you meet the man who survived 2 shipwrecks and was the only survivor both times. The doomed ship and the lucky man. Imagine stepping off a wrecked ship, waterlogged and half dead, thinking, "Thank God I survived." Now, imagine doing it again. That was the fate or cruel joke dealt to one Thomas Griffith in the 17th century. In 1660, Griffith was sailing aboard a vessel bound for Ireland when it went down. Everyone perished except him. A fluke, perhaps. Divine providence, maybe. He made it to shore, probably half drowned and in full disbelief, and resumed his life, until fate decided to rerun the trauma. Years later, he boarded another ship. Maybe he thought lightning wouldn't strike twice. Maybe he laughed at the notion. And then the ship sank, again. And once more, he was the sole survivor. Now, surviving a shipwreck once is the kind of story that earns you drinks at the tavern for the rest of your life. Surviving 2, as the only living soul both times, places you in the weird cross-section of miracle and statistical impossibility. People began whispering. Was he blessed? Cursed? Did he make deals with ocean gods? Or perhaps the other passengers were just that unlucky. This wasn't just about improbable odds. It was about identity. Griffith became a walking omen. Sailors feared being on the same vessel as him. Some believed he carried death like baggage. Others thought he'd been chosen, somehow, to always float while others drowned. He lived the rest of his life with that double shadow 2 ships beneath the sea, and a world above that never quite knew what to make of him. And while his fate was to be adrift and alone, our next story is about 4 men who sang together until the day they said goodbye from a rooftop to a world that didn't even know it was the end. The Beatles' last concert. It was the 30th of January, 1969. London was gray, cold, indifferent, the kind of day that feels like an ellipsis. Atop the Apple Corps building, 4 men set up their instruments. No tickets, no announcements, no screaming fans, just amplifiers, camera crews, and one final breath before the curtain closed. This was the Beatles' last public performance, a spontaneous rooftop concert immortalized in the film Let It Be. It wasn't grand, it wasn't rehearsed, it was raw, fragmented, and somehow perfect. A band on the brink of implosion, still managing to sync up one last time. They played Get Back, Don't Let Me Down, I've Got a Feeling songs that felt more like coded messages than setlist items. Passersby stared up in confusion. Police showed up, trying to shut it down. But the music went on, not because it was allowed, but because it had to happen. The real coincidence lies not in the music, but in the moment. The Beatles, the most meticulously documented band in history, ended their public journey not with a concert in Madison Square Garden or a global farewell tour, but on a rooftop, nearly drowned out by traffic. No warning, no encore, just one last jam session between brothers who had already begun drifting apart. And yet, this unannounced goodbye became one of the most iconic moments in music history. The accidental symmetry of beginning their fame in chaos and ending it in understated rebellion. A band that conquered the world finished not with a bang, but with a semi-audible chord fading into city noise. Coincidence? Or poetic resignation? And while they played their final notes in defiance of gravity, another man was counting down the final minutes of a king's life with uncanny precision. The man who predicted his own death. William John Warner, better known by his mystical pseudonym Chero, was not a man lacking confidence. An Irish astrologer, palmist, and self-proclaimed prophet to the elite, Chero read the hands of presidents, kings, and writers with the casual poise of someone who'd already seen the ending. He claimed to see death like others see traffic lights, predictable, color-coded, and inevitable. So when he confidently declared that King Edward VII would die on May 6, 1910, the public mostly rolled their eyes. The king, after all, wasn't in poor health. And Chero, while popular, had the scent of a stage magician who swapped tarot cards for royal appointments. But then May 6 came, and so did death. King Edward VII, the man who had once ruled over the largest empire on earth, breathed his last exactly as Chero predicted. No wiggle room, no vague time frame, just a cold, hard date hand, the quiet extinguishing of a royal lung. Suddenly, Chero's critics weren't laughing. They were asking questions. Had he seen it in the stars? In the king's palm? Or had he simply rolled the dice with a flair for drama and won? Statisticians will argue about probability and educated guessing. Skeptics whisper about lucky intuition dressed in the robes of prophecy. But to those who believed in omens, Chero wasn't just a mystique, was proof that fate could be whispered, not shouted. And if one man could predict a king's death, what does it mean when a composer spends his final days writing music for his own funeral? The composer who died, while composing his requiem. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was not exactly the type to go gentle into that good night. He was flamboyant, chaotic, brilliant and, in the end, deeply paranoid. In 1791, he began composing his Requiem Mass in D minor, commissioned under mysterious circumstances. The client was anonymous, the fee generous, and Mozart, still young and relatively healthy, was immediately unnerved. He became convinced the piece was for himself, that he was writing his own death into music, notes as premonitions, harmonies as elegies, a musical suicide note unfolding measure by measure. As he wrote, his health deteriorated. He collapsed. He raved. He begged his wife, Constance, not to leave him alone. And as he lay dying, he dictated parts of the Requiem to his student, Franz Xaver Süssmayr, who would later complete it after Mozart's death. The final piece both literally and spiritually remains a haunting blend of genius and ghostwriting. It's tempting to romanticize this as fate. A man composing his own farewell, as if destiny handed him both a pen and a ticking clock. But the commission was real, The sickness was real. And still, the coincidence burns that Mozart's final creative act was to craft the very mass he would never hear, played at the funeral he never attended. Was it intuition? Did he sense his mortality creeping in through the treble clef? The requiem remains unfinished by his hand, but fully saturated with his shadow. Every bar sounds like a man staring into the abyss and daring it to blink. And if last words in music can feel like fate, what about the actual last words of a king, when his final breath ends not in grace, but in rage? The king's last words. King George V, monarch of the United Kingdom and Emperor of India, was a man of habit, stoic, proper, impeccably dressed even when dying. By 1936, he was already slipping into unconsciousness. The court doctors knew what was coming, as did the royal family. They wanted his death to be dignified, photogenic, regal. He had other plans. Reportedly, his final words uttered with the dying breath of a sovereign who had spent decades repressing emotion were, "God damn you," addressed, fittingly, to a nurse who dared administer a sedative without his permission. Not exactly Shakespeare. Now, it's entirely possible that George V's dying words have been exaggerated or misquoted, but the quote stuck. Why? Because it's perfect. It strips away the polished image of monarchy and reveals the raw humanity beneath. The man who had ruled an empire died not with a prayer, not with a farewell to his subjects, but with an expletive hurled into the void. There's a particular kind of irony in that. Monarchs are expected to go out like Roman statua stoic, serene, mythic. George V went out like a man stubbing his toe on the gates of eternity. Coincidence? Maybe just a dark punchline. Or maybe it's another reminder that death doesn't respect titles. It doesn't offer dignity on demand. It just shows up nurse, sedative, and all. And if final words can betray the man behind the crown, what about a novelist who described the machinery of the future before it even existed? The author who wrote about a submarine before its invention. Jules Verne wasn't just ahead of his time. He was waiting at the finish line, waving back. In 1870, he published 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas, a high-pressure odyssey through the deep featuring the Nautilusa futuristic submarine, so technologically advanced, it made the world's actual engineers look like toddlers with snorkels. The Nautilus was electric, self-powered, capable of sustained underwater voyages across oceans. It had a library, a pipe organ, and enough aesthetic flair to make steampunk blush. At the time, none of this was real. Submarines existed in the crudest form, sure, but they were little more than metallic coffins designed to sink on command and hopefully resurface. Verne's vision was so far ahead that it bordered on absurd. And yet, decades later, the world caught up. Submarines resembling Verne's fictional dream began rolling out of shipyards. Silent, deadly, elegant. They even adopted some of his terminology. Naval historians still tilt their heads when reading Verne's technical specs because so much of it aligns with modern reality. He wasn't guessing, he was predicting with flair. Was Verne a genius? Certainly. But the real coincidence is how closely the world followed his blueprint. Did engineers subconsciously build the future he imagined? Did he inspire what he seemed to foresee? Or was it just one of those moments where fiction taps into the deeper patterns of inevitable progress? It's hard to say, but it makes you wonder if Verne had a telescope aimed not at the stars, but at the future's blueprint drawer. And while the Nautilus played on silent currents, another orchestra once played through screams and sinking steel, and their final song became legend. The Titanic film and the real orchestra. When James Cameron's Titanic hit theaters in 1997, it wasn't just the iceberg that chilled audiences, it was the quiet nobility of the ship's band. As passengers scrambled, panicked, and drowned, the musicians kept playing. Violins on a deck tilted toward doom. The moment felt cinematic, poetic, almost too perfect. Except it wasn't fiction. In real life, the Titanic's band, led by Wallace Hartley, did indeed continue to perform as the ship went down. Witnesses recalled the final piece being "Nearer, My God, to Thee," a hymn. An act of musical defiance in the face of oblivion. Cameron didn't have to dramatize it, he only had to tell it straight. The idea that these men musicians, not soldiers, chose to meet death with their instruments is both baffling and oddly comforting. They didn't run, they didn't scream. They scored the tragedy, turning chaos into cadence. It wasn't bravery in the traditional sense, it was ritual, like priests with bows instead of prayers. And here's the coincidence, that a modern film, written with Hollywood sentimentality, happened to be so precisely aligned with history's cruel poetry. You'd expect embellishment. What you got was near literal truth. Why does this matter? Because it's rare when cinema catches up to the strange dignity of reality. The orchestra wasn't remembered because the film told us to feel something. The film worked because the real moment had already done the emotional heavy lifting. And if music can frame disaster, what happens when a man's birth date is shared with a nation's declaration of peace? The man who was born on the day the war ended, the 30th of November, 1874. Winston Churchill was born into a world still licking its colonial wounds and flexing its imperial muscles. That same day, across the Atlantic, a signature was drying on the Treaty of Paris, formally ending the American Revolutionary War. Yes, the dates don't quite line up with modern textbook chronology. The war had already functionally ended. But that symbolic paper, the punctuation mark of history, found its match in a newborn child who would go on to become one of the 20th century's loudest war drums and, paradoxically, one of its most poetic voices for freedom. Churchill was war incarnate. He loved it, feared it, romanticized it. He charged into battle on horseback and navigated it by radio wave. That he arrived on the day a war died feels almost karmic, a replacement part sent by the universe. War ends, war begins again, but this time with cigars, wit, and bulldog tenacity. Coincidence? Perhaps. But it's the kind that makes historians tilt their heads. What are the odds that one of the century's most indomitable wartime leaders would arrive just as another, war arguably the first fight for Western self-rule, officially bowed out? History doesn't always provide clean handoffs, but sometimes it accidentally drafts one man to stand on the ashes of another era and light a new fire. And speaking of fire, our next tale involves not just resignation but papal abdication. Twice. The two popes who resigned. In the Vatican's long and theatrical history, the word resignation doesn't come up much. Papal office is, in theory, a lifetime appointment till death do you sanctify. But in 2013, Pope Benedict XVI stunned the world by stepping down. Health reasons, he said, a whisper of humility in a position built on permanence. It was the first papal resignation in nearly 600 years. Before Benedict, you'd have to go back to 1415, when Pope Gregory XII resigned to end a schism that had fractured the Catholic Church with three competing popes. His stepping down wasn't pious, it was political. He gave up the throne for unity, not because he wanted to. And before Gregory? Celestine V in 1294. A hermit dragged into power against his will, who found the job so unbearable, he wrote his own resignation law just so he could use it. Three popes, centuries apart. Each resignation triggered by crisis. Health, politics, spiritual exhaustion. Each breaking a tradition steeped in divine authority and stubbornness. And each time, the church stumbled, mumbled, and eventually adjusted, not with grace but with awkward, begrudging necessity. The coincidence isn't just the rarity, it's that each resignation felt like the world cracking open. People didn't know how to react. Popes don't quit. That's the whole point. You suffer in silence, shrouded in incense and Latin until God calls you home. Yet here they were, 3 moments in time when even the infallible decided they'd had enough. And while popes may resign from their heavenly duties, there's another pair of cities founded under the same date, across centuries and empires that never quite managed to separate. The Twin Cities. Rome, eternal and imperial, was born on the 21st of April, 753 BCat, least according to legend, which is always more persuasive than fact. A pair of twins, a she-wolf, and a murder later, and the world had its first empire in training. Exactly 796 years later, on the 21st of April, 43 AD, another city was officially founded. Londinium. You know it today as London. The Romans built it as a strategic port and trading hub, a foothold on the misty isles of the Britons, and in some twisted cosmic joke, they stamped its birthday to match Rome's. 2 cities. Same founding date. One became the spiritual capital of the empire, the other its most distant jewel. Both endured plagues, fires, and failed invasions. Both became centers of culture and chaos, of power and paradox. It's almost too neat that the world's 2 most historically symbolic cities so ancient, one modern share a birthday feels less like coincidence and more like a baton passed through time, from Caesar to Churchill, from the Colosseum to the Crown. Some historians shrug it off. Roman record-keeping wasn't exactly known for its precision. But even if it's apocryphal, the story holds power. Because dates, like myths, are anchors. And nothing says legacy, quite like syncing your origin to Rome's. And while cities are born and reborn across centuries, sometimes voices echo in more confined quarters like the raspy chorus of 3 characters, all performed by one woman. The voice of Marge Simpson and her sisters. Julie Kovner doesn't have the face of a matriarchal icon, but she has the voice. And that voice, with its gravelly charm, gave birth to one of television's most recognizable characters, Marge Simpson. Blue beehive, endlessly patient, prone to nervous humming. But Kovner didn't stop there. She also voices Marge's twin sisters Patty and Selma Bouvier, chain-smoking DMV lifers with vocal cords forged in ashtrays. The difference is tone, not timbre. You hear the same instrument, tuned 3 different ways: resigned love, jaded cynicism, and nicotine, fueled contempt. Here's where the coincidence kicks in. Marge, Patty, and Selma are often seen as 3 versions of the same woman: past, present, future. The echo of Marge's voice in her sisters isn't just casting economy, it's metaphysical commentary. They're literally all voiced by the same person. They sound alike because they are alike. Just variations of choices unmade. Kovner's triple role wasn't intended as deep metaphor. It was practical. But art has a way of slipping into its own coincidences. The audience doesn't hear 3 characters, they hear one woman slowly unraveling across 3 timelines. And while animation allows for this strange vocal time loop, real life sometimes takes its echoes to bone-cracking extremes, like a man who survived not 1, but 2 skyscraper falls. The man who fell off a skyscraper. Twice. In most lives, falling from a skyscraper is a one-time event. If it happens, it's usually the final chapter, not the midpoint. But Joseph Figlock was not most people. In 1930s Detroit, he became the unwitting centerpiece of one of history's most absurd loops. Figlock, a city worker, was walking along the street when a baby fell from a 4th-story window and landed squarely on him. Miraculously, both he and the baby survived, with only minor injuries. A freak accident. A bizarre tale to tell his friends. End of story? Not even close. The following year, different day, different baby, same street, another child, tumbled from yet another high window and landed on, you guessed it, Joseph Figlock. Once again, both survived. same man. Same gravitational misfortune. Same statistically impossible outcome. You could almost hear the universe cackling. Figlock became a walking airbag, a magnet for airborne infants. People began to joke that babies were aiming for him. The odds of even one of those events occurring are astronomical. Twice? It borders on metaphysical performance art. Coincidence? Certainly, but the kind that borders on myth. Figlock didn't just catch babies, caught fate mid-fall, and in doing so, he became a bizarre symbol of accidental grace. While most people fear falling, Figlock proved that sometimes someone's already there to catch you, even if they don't want to be. And if that makes you squirm, consider another family who couldn't be caught, no matter how high their status. A royal lineage wiped out in a basement with no witnesses, no survivors, and no forgiveness. The Romanov family execution. They were once the image of imperial power. Nicholas II, the Tsar of all the Russias, and his wife Alexandra, with their 5 delicate children. They posed for photos, wrote in cursive, and clung to the myth of divine right long after the people had lost their appetite for kings. By 1918, they were prisoners of their own legacy. The Russian Revolution had upended the world they knew, and the Bolsheviks were not interested in negotiations. On the night of the 17th of July, the entire Romanov family was led to a basement in Yekaterinburg. A doctor, a few loyal servants, and the children. No trial, no ceremony, just bullets. The execution was chaotic. Bullets ricocheted off jewels hidden in corsets. Smoke and screams filled the room. When it was over, the Romanov dynasty 3 centuries old was reduced to silence and scattered bones. But the coincidence lies not in their death, but in the eerie precision of it. All of them, slaughtered in a single room. No accidental survivor, no last-minute escape. In a century full of messy regime changes, the Romanovs were erased with surgical completeness. Many still whisper about Anastasia, the daughter who maybe survived. Bodies were missing for decades. Imposters emerged. The myth of the lost princess still lingers because something about that perfect execution feels too complete. History doesn't usually tie its threads so tightly, but here, it did. And in doing so, it left behind not just a royal void but a ghost story disguised as revolution. From emperors to astronauts, let's now leap from one fantasy to another when a fictional star captain talks to a real-life spaceman. The Star Trek actor and the astronaut. In the 1960s, William Shatner became the face of interstellar diplomacy, boldly going where no man had gone before, least on television. As Captain James T. Kirk, he commanded the USS Enterprise with dramatic pauses, a heroic jawline, and a knack for kissing aliens. He was fiction, he was camp, but he also became a symbol of what humanity could be. Decades later, Shatner found himself speaking with Chris Hadfield, an actual astronaut aboard the International Space Station. That's right, Captain Kirk, the actor, talking to a real man floating above Earth in a tin can of dreams and recycled oxygen. Fiction and reality, finally shaking hands in orbit. It wasn't just a PR stunt. It was poetic alignment. Hadfield had grown up watching Star Trek. So had millions of future engineers, physicists, and astronauts. The show's impossible idealism had shaped their very real trajectories. So when Shatner and Hadfield spoke, it wasn't two men chatting, it was one man thanking another for building the fantasy that had made his reality possible. What are the odds that a childhood inspiration would become a conversational partner in zero gravity? That a fictional captain would live long enough to witness his role go from pulp to prophecy? Coincidence? Sure, but it's also the way dreams loop back around. One man imagined the future. The other launched into it. And while Shatner's voice once echoed through television speakers, another Signala-coded sequence of dots and dashes delivered history's most infamous death notice in real time: the inventor and the assassination. In a perfect twist of irony, the man who revolutionized communication also received news of revolution via the very thing he invented. Samuel Morse, painter turned inventor, developed the telegraph and the code that bore his name: dots and dashes, electric pulses traveling faster than any message before. With one invention, he collapsed time across distance. Empires could now whisper through wires. On the night of the 14th of April, 1865, Morse was in Washington, D.C., when the pulse of history shattered again. President Abraham Lincoln had been shot. The news arrived quickly via telegraph. The very code Morse had engineered to bring people together was now being used to announce the nation's greatest loss. It was as if the invention had matured overnight, capable not just of business, but of mourning. What are the odds that the man who wired the world would be in the Capitol when one of its most defining tragedies occurred and would learn about it through his own creation? It wasn't staged. It wasn't ceremonial. It was the kind of accidental poetry only real life produces. A man watching his technological child deliver the first pangs of modern grief. Historians rarely focus on Morse in that moment, but imagine being him, seeing your tool of progress become a funeral bell in code. Dots, dashes, death. Technology always outpaces morality. But sometimes it keeps perfect pace with irony. And if codes can spell doom in real time, what happens when the vehicle that carried one assassination also flashes a numerical prophecy of peace? The unlucky car of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. We've already discussed the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that chaotic, world-altering domino that triggered World War I. But let's rewind to the car. Not the bullets, not the assassin. The car. It was a great and stiff double phaeton, as grand and unassuming as any pre-war automobile, but its license plate was the detail that history would underline: a 3118. A seemingly random string of characters until the end of the war. Then, it wasn't random at all. The armistice that ended World War I was signed on the 11th of November, 1918, or numerically, 11 divided by 11 divided by 18. That's when people began noticing the eerie overlap. A 3118 suddenly looked like a date hiding in plain sight, a coded endpoint engraved on the vehicle that carried the war's ignition point. Coincidence? Probably, but the symmetry is too cruel to ignore. The same car that carried the Archduke to his death and the world into war was, tagged with the date piece, would finally be declared 4 years and millions of bodies later. Was it prophecy in metal? A cosmic joke? Or just the twisted human habit of extracting meaning from meaningless things? Either way, it remains one of the most morbid pieces of license plate trivia in human history. And if you think the future can't be previewed in fiction, wait until you meet the man who imagined a revolution and then watched it come true. The man who predicted the Russian Revolution. In 1913, Anatole France, French novelist, thinker, and professional contrarian, published The Revolt of the Angels. It wasn't about Russia, not explicitly. It was a theological satire about fallen angels and intellectual rebellion. But buried within its pages was a surreal forecast. A violent, idealistic uprising born in the East, one that would upend hierarchies and redraw the moral map. He didn't name Lenin, he didn't draft a manifesto, but the spirit of the Russian Revolution flickered through the fiction like a warning flare. And just 4 years later, in 1917, Russia imploded. The Tsar fell, Bolsheviks rose, the angels of power were toppled sometimes, literally. France wasn't a prophet, he was a cynic. But cynicism has a strange way of predicting history, especially when empires are teetering and ideologies ferment beneath the surface. He wasn't alone in sensing the pressure, but he was one of the few to fictionalize it with such prescient tone. Is this coincidence? Is it just that revolutions tend to write their own teasers years in advance in art and rumor? Perhaps. But Anatole France didn't just predict the revolution, he captured its mood before it had fully arrived. And while his revolution was metaphorical, the deaths that followed were not. Because when art and reality blur, sometimes both end up in the bathwater like two famous singers, separated by decades, found dead in the same tragic way. The singer who died in a bathtub. Water, in mythology, is transformation. In reality, it's just cold porcelain and slow silence. Yet two iconic musicians decades apart were found dead in bathtubs, transforming legacy into legend in the eeriest of ways. Jim Morrison, the mercurial frontman of The Doors, died in 1971, Paris, age 27, official cause, heart failure, found in a bathtub, no autopsy, no answers. Just a myth, sealed behind a bathroom door in a foreign city. Fast forward to 2012, Whitney Houston, one of the greatest voices ever recorded, age 48, found dead in a Beverly Hills hotel bathtub just hours before a high-profile party. Prescription drugs. Alcohol. The coroners said accidental drowning. The tabloids screamed otherwise. Two bathtubs, two icons. One surrounded by poetry and decay, the other by glamour and grief. Different genres, different demographics, same still, tiled silence. The coincidence isn't just the setting, it's the symbolism. Bathtubs are supposed to be mundane, safe, intimate. Yet in these two cases, they became altars, shrines to fame's final collapse. The water that once soothed, now swallowed. Fans speculated endlessly. Was it depression? Escape? Cosmic timing? The eerie parallel became part of the posthumous lore how two giants of music ended in the same quiet posture, as if the bathroom itself had been waiting. And as strange as twin bathtub deaths may be, it pales next to the odd procession of race car champions who seem destined not to celebrate victory but to die soon after crossing the finish line. The doomed race car drivers. Winning the Indianapolis 500 is supposed to crown you a legend, not stamp your death warrant. But throughout the early 20th century, it seemed that racing glory came with a countdown clock. Gaston Chevrolet won the Indy 500 in 1920. Later that year, he died in another race. Joe Boyer won in 1924, dead before year's end. Then came Bill Vukovich, back-to-back winner in 1953 and 1954. In 1955, during a race he was dominating, he crashed and burned, literally gone. Not one, not two, but multiple winners meeting death within a short window after their victories. The patterns began to unsettle even the boldest drivers. Fans noticed, so did journalists. And soon, the Indy 500 gained a strange postscript: win, and you might die. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the very traits that push a driver to win: recklessness, speed addiction, defiance of fear, are the same ones that steer them toward a deadly end. Still, you'd expect at least a few years of life to enjoy the trophy, not a body bag before the champagne runs dry. There's a theory, unprovable but seductive, that some victories are too perfect, that the universe, having allowed you to taste triumph, decides it must balance the scale, a cosmic red flag. And if speeding metal and burnt rubber hold omens, imagine what ancient curses still linger in the dust of a dead king's tomb, waiting, perhaps, to make headlines centuries after burial. That's 33 coincidences down a third of the way through, and already reality's starting to feel negotiable. If your brain's still intact, hit that subscribe button before the next twist rewires it. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Sunrise in Nairobi? Midnight in Nova Scotia? Let's see who else is questioning everything at the exact same moment. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb and the curse In 1922, Howard Carter slid a chisel through the seal of Tutankhamun's tomb and cracked open the most famous burial chamber in archaeological history. Gold, statues, sarcophagi, and something invisible, a legend that would outlive them all. The curse of the pharaoh. Soon after the tomb was opened, people connected to the dig began dying. Lord Carnarvon, who financed the expedition, succumbed to an infected mosquito bite. A random coincidence? Maybe. But the deaths kept coming: assistants, visitors, even distant associates. Pneumonia, poison, accidents, illnesses with no clear cause. The press devoured it. The idea was irresistible, that ancient kings could strike back from beyond the grave, that the tomb, sealed for over 3,000 years, had not forgiven its violation. That history quite literally could kill. Scientists have offered explanations: mold spores, exotic bacteria, psychological suggestion, but those don't explain how the pattern lined up so neatly, or why so many of the dead were young, healthy, and seemingly plucked by fate, not biology. Carter himself lived for another 17 years, denying any curse, but by then, it didn't matter. The myth had calcified. People remembered the gold, yes, but they remembered the deaths more. Because there's something deeply satisfying, if terrifying, about the idea that the past can fight back. And if that sounds dramatic, wait until you hear what happens when actors become superheroes and their lives take a nosedive right after donning the cape. The actor who played Superman in The Curse. To wear the S on your chest is to court immortality, or so it seems. Superman, symbol of hope, invincibility, American idealism dressed in blue tights. But off-screen, the men who played him have often been anything but invincible. Enter the so-called Superman curse, a pattern that begins innocently and ends in tragedy. George Reeves, television's first Man of Steel in the 1950s, died of a gunshot wound to the head. Officially ruled a suicide, but the circumstances remain murky, suspicious, and unresolved. He was found in full costume, the symbol of invulnerability undone by a very mortal ending. Then came Christopher Reeve, whose portrayal in the 1978 film Superman redefined the role. Tall, dignified, kind-eyed, he was Superman. Until 1995, when a horseback riding accident left him paralyzed from the neck down. One moment, he was flying. The next, he was grounded forever. Other actors linked to the franchise met early deaths, career collapses, or personal disasters. The pattern wasn't universal, but it was persistent enough to seed the legend. Journalists coined it. Fans whispered about it, and Hollywood producers began to hesitate, because casting Superman, it seemed, came with an invisible contract and a cost. Coincidence? The rational mind says yes. Different people, different decades, unrelated fates. But we don't build myths on logic, we build them on patterns. And when the same role keeps ending in personal tragedy, we pay attention. We look for causality in the costume. And if myth can cling to a role, maybe history clings to campaigns, because two megalomania centuries apart decided to conquer Russia in the same month and got buried by the same snow. Napoleon and Hitler's Russian campaigns. The first rule of invading Russia is simple: don't ever. But history has a way of putting ego before instruction. In June 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte marched over 600,000 men into the Russian Empire. He expected a swift victory. Instead, he found scorched earth, fleeing armies, and a winter that turned his Grande Armée into frozen bones and broken morale. By the end of it, fewer than 100,000 returned. The rest? Swallowed by cold and chaos. Fast forward to June 1941. Adolf Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. 3 million Axis soldiers surge into Soviet territory. Initial victories, fast advances, high morale. Then the Russian winter arrives again, like a sequel nobody asked for. Mud, snow, ice, starvation. The same terrain that broke Napoleon now humbled Hitler. Both campaigns began in June. Both faced fierce Russian resistance. Both reached Moscow and realized too late that Russia doesn't collapse. It swallows. The coincidence isn't just the dates or the defeats, it's the hubris. Two tyrants, separated by more than a century, made the same strategic blunder, convinced they were the exception to history's rule. Both ignored the warnings, both believed their armies were unstoppable, and both were reminded, brutally, that climate cares nothing for ideology. Historians love this parallel. It's poetic, devastating, symmetrical, the same mistake, repeated in uniform. And if history loves nothing more than a repeated tragedy, consider the chilling tale of a fictional cannibal and the real-life shipwreck that followed his exact menu. The author who wrote about a shipwreck, and the actual shipwreck, again. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe published The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. It was his only full-length novel, and it included a horrific scene. A shipwrecked crew, starving, lost at sea, draw lots, and kill the cabin boy to survive. The boy's name? Richard Parker. Readers recoiled. It was macabre, even by Poe's standards. Fictional cannibalism, served with literary flair. Fast forward to 1884. The yacht Mignonette sinks en route to Australia. 4 men escape on a lifeboat. Days pass, starvation sets in. Eventually, they do what desperate men have always done, they draw lots. They kill and eat the weakest among them, the cabin boy. His name? Richard Parker.
Yes, the same name, same role, same fate.
Coincidence? It feels mathematically impossible. How does a fictional character, with a unique name and specific death, find himself mirrored in reality half a century later? Skeptics say it's fluke. Richard Parker was a relatively common name, and cannibalism among shipwreck survivors wasn't unheard of, but it's the precision that rattles. Poe wrote it for shock. Reality played it out for horror. This wasn't prophecy. It wasn't even inspired imitation. It was unplanned alignment, and that's what makes it worse. The randomness adds weight. It wasn't scripted, it just happened, again. And when disasters align with fiction, we're left with the haunting question: is the universe copying our nightmares, or are we just remembering too well? Because the next story features a mission doomed by a number, and a moment where a problem became the understatement of the century. The Apollo 13 mission, and the number 13. NASA doesn't believe in superstition, or at least, it pretends not to. Rockets run on math, not myths. And yet Apollo 13 became a case study in how numbers can still haunt even the most scientifically disciplined minds. Launched at 13 to 13 Central Street Standard Time on the 11th of April, 1970, Apollo 13 was NASA's third mission intended to land humans on the moon. The launch pad? Number 39, divisible by 3 and 13. The mission number itself, of course, was 13. At the time, no one blinked. NASA had already put 2 crews on the moon. Confidence was high. Calculations were precise. Then, less than 56 hours into the mission, an oxygen tank exploded. "Houston, we've had a problem," became the most understated line in the history of catastrophe. The crew's lives hung in the balance. The moon landing was scrapped. The mission was redefined in real time. Survival. Apollo 13 became the most famous failed success in the history of spaceflight. Everyone made it home, barely, by ingenuity, luck, and duct tape. But the number remained. The 13S hung in the air like cursed echoes. People began noticing. 13, 13, Pad 39, Mission 13, an explosion on the 13th of April. It was too much for the tinfoil hatters to ignore, and even NASA quietly shifted tone in later missions. Coincidence? Yes, also deeply uncomfortable. Because when the math goes sideways and the numbers line up just wrong, you start to wonder if some equations come preloaded with doom. And if Apollo 13 was cursed from above, our next tale is grounded literally. A man who didn't tempt fate once, but 7 times, with lightning. The man who was struck by lightning 7 times. Roy Sullivan wasn't just unlucky, he was cosmically targeted. Between 1942 and 1977, this Virginia park ranger was struck by lightning 7 times. 7. In one lifetime. Most people don't survive one. Sullivan survived all of them. The lightning hit him in a watchtower, in a truck, on a trail, even inside a ranger station. One bolt set his hair on fire. Another blasted his toenail off. One even struck him while fishing, knocking him into the water where, unsurprisingly, he was then attacked by a bear. What makes it even stranger? He carried water with him constantly, to put out the fires caused by his own body being ignited. Roy became a walking lightning rod with a pulse. Scientists have tried to make sense of it. Sullivan spent more time outdoors than most. He worked in storm-prone areas. Statistically, his odds were higher. But higher doesn't mean 7 times. You could live 100 lives and not get those odds. And here's where it really twists. Despite his survival, despite his almost mythic resistance to nature's wrath, Sullivan died by suicide. Not thunder, not fire. Silence. Was it the trauma? The isolation? Or did surviving the impossible make the rest of life feel too unbearably ordinary? Roy Sullivan became legend part man, part cautionary tale. Proof that the universe doesn't always need a reason to pick on someone. Sometimes it just does. And while Roy tangled with the sky, another man played a different tune that would become the background score to Alien Love, Star Wars, and everything in between. The composer of the Star Wars theme in E.T., John Williams, doesn't just write music. He writes prophecy. If aliens were to land on Earth and ask to understand human emotion, you could probably just play them his scores. He composed the themes for Star Wars and E.T., the extraterrestrial, 2 of the most beloved, iconic, endlessly quoted film scores in cinematic history. You don't need to know the movie. 1 bar, and you feel it. Adventure, longing, wonder. Williams's music bypasses language and goes straight to the nervous system. But here's the eerie alignment. Both films are about alien contact. One dramatic and epic. The other tender and intimate. And both rely entirely on music to make their magic stick. Strip either film of Williams's score, and they collapse. Star Wars becomes pulp. E.T. becomes a weird puppet movie. The coincidence isn't that one man composed both. It's that he did so in such perfectly aligned emotional tones, each score acting like an antenna for the human soul. How did the same composer, within a few years, manage to define 2 utterly different kinds of alien encounters with such precision? Williams became the musical translator for the unknown. His themes are now shorthand for the cosmos, both terrifying and touching. His work proves that while language builds civilizations, music builds myth. And as myths go, some begin on the 4th of July, with the deaths of men who signed the very idea of a nation into being. The 2 presidents, who died on the same day of the month. There's something ominously theatrical about a country's founders dying on its birthday, as if the nation itself needed a blood sacrifice for its annual candles. On the 4th of July, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, 2 former presidents died. Not just any presidents, but founding fathers. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Friends turned rivals turned pen pals whose legacies were entwined like political ivy. Their deaths, hours apart on the same historic day, were so improbably timed that even cynics paused. Adams's final words were reportedly, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was wrong. Jefferson had died earlier that morning. A cosmic prank, or the universe's cruel sense of irony. Either way, the timing was eerie. America celebrated freedom with parades and speeches while two of its architects quietly signed off. 5 years later, in 1831, James Monroe, another founding figure, also died on the 4th of July. 3 presidents, same day. The math doesn't hold up to logic, but the symbolism is overwhelming. Was this divine choreography? A weird statistical fluke? Or did something in their constitution, physical or historical, insist on going out with a bang? What's undeniable is how it shaped the mythology of American destiny. It made the 4th of July more than fireworks. It made it sacred, not just the birth of a nation but the graves of its forefathers. And while founding fathers can't sue for poetic timing, another man tried suing a television show because a fictional version of himself was stealing his thunder. The Seinfeld character and the real-life person. George Costanza, the neurotic, balding avatar of self-inflicted misery on Seinfeld, is a character so precise in his awkwardness that he must be drawn from life. Turns out was. Co-creator Larry David always admitted that George was based heavily on himself. But in 1998, a man named Michael Costanza filed a lawsuit against the creators of the show, claiming that the character was based on him, a real person, a former college acquaintance of Jerry Seinfeld. The similarities, he insisted, were uncanny. The name, the mannerisms, the hairline, the bad luck. The court didn't agree. The case was thrown out, but the coincidence lingered. What are the odds that a fictional character, meant to represent the insecurities of a generation, would accidentally mirror a man with the same last name, who also happened to know the people who made him famous? It's the kind of collision where art and life blur so thoroughly, you can't tell who's parodying whom. Did Seinfeld accidentally clone a man? Or did that man simply become George by living long enough with the same moniker? More than a lawsuit, it was a strange echo of the show's central joke, that nothing matters, everything repeats, and everyone is a character in someone else's sitcom. And while George Costanza couldn't catch a break, neither could the residents of 17th century London when a city's greatest fire aligned with the most infamous number in Scripture. The Great Fire of London and the number 666. It started in a bakery. A small ember in the early hours of the 2nd of September, 1666, ignited what would become the Great Fire of London, a disaster that consumed most of the medieval city within days. Homes, churches, businesses gone. St. Paul's Cathedral collapsed in flames, an entire cityscape reduced to ash and cinders. But then came the numerology. The fire began in 1666. The number 666. The number of the beast. Revelation's favorite curse. Suddenly, the disaster had a new narrative. It wasn't just fire, it was prophecy. Divine punishment. Apocalypse in brick and timber. People searched for meaning. Was it sin? A curse? A sign? Religious pamphlets exploded across England, accusing everything from Catholic conspiracies to millennial damnation. That the fire began on Pudding Lane only added to the absurdity. Judgment Day, courtesy of dessert. Historians now chalk it up to poor city planning, dry timber, and a stiff wind. But try telling that to the survivors who watched their world burn, right on the nose of that satanic number. Coincidence? Maybe. But when a city's greatest catastrophe aligns with the most infamous number in Christian mythology, the question isn't if people will see a signet, how many will? And if divine retribution can arrive on schedule, what do you call it when someone saves a baby only to be saved by that baby decades later? The man who saved a baby and was later saved by that baby. In the 1930s, George Willison was just doing his job. As a lifeguard, you expect moments of high tension, perhaps even the occasional miracle. One day, he pulled a drowning infant from the water. Saved him. No parade, no statue, just a man doing what needed to be done. Fast forward several decades, Willison, now elderly, finds himself in trouble again, this time the drowning man. Weakened, struggling in the same element he once mastered, he begins to sink. A younger man notices, dives in, and pulls him to safety. The younger man? The same baby he had rescued all those years ago. Pause. Breathe. Let the loop close in your mind. It sounds like the plot of a holiday commercial. Rescue, kindness, repayment. But this wasn't scripted. It was an authentic boomerang of fate. One life saved, only to return the favor across generations. They didn't recognize each other instantly. It took conversation, realization, the slow dawning of a memory neither knew would matter. Coincidence? Maybe, but it smells too neat for chance. The probability of two specific lives intersecting twice under such extraordinary circumstances? Astronomical. More than irony, it's the kind of loop that makes you suspicious of reality. Like something, somewhere, wanted the circle to complete itself. It wasn't just about survival, it was about cosmic symmetry. And while fate sometimes rescues with poetic timing, it can also walk across a street with album cover nonchalance. Speaking of which, let's talk about Four Men and One Zebra Crossing, the Beatles' album Abbey Road and the London studio. On the 8th of August, 1969, four men walked across a street, single file, no fanfare, no announcement. Just another recording day at Abbey Road Studios. But a photographer was there. One snapshot. The result? An album cover that became one of the most iconic images in music history. Abbey Road, Paul barefoot, John in white, Ringo in black, George in denim. A pedestrian moment turned into global myth. Here's the kicker. The studio was on Abbey Road. The album was recorded there. And that crosswalk? Just outside the building. Coincidence? Not quite. But the symmetry is undeniable. The band names the album after the street, then immortalizes that street by walking across it, then changes the street's meaning forever. Tourists still flock there today to recreate the photo, halting traffic and mimicking the stride of four men who were on the verge of breaking up. What's eerie is how final the image feels. None of them smiling, Paul out of step, the lineup echoing a funeral procession, so said the conspiracy theorists. Many fans later theorized that this was the band's farewell and somehow they knew it. What should have been an afterthought, a quick photo outside the studio, became a prophetic exit. It's a picture of a band walking away, and as they crossed that road, they also crossed from unity into history. But while their art captured emotion and chord progressions, another Womantoe centuries early used fiction to electrify the very question of life and death. The author of Frankenstein and the Scientific Context. Mary Shelley wasn't just writing horror, she was weaponizing it. In 1818, at the age of 20, she released Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus, a novel about a scientist who assembles life from dead tissue only to create a being he can neither understand nor control. Sound familiar? At the time, the public wasn't just reading it as fantasy, it was borderline plausible. Scientists were toying with electricity, discovering that galvanic currents could make frog legs twitch post-mortem. If lightning could animate meat, why not men? Shelley had been steeped in these discussions. Her circle included poets, radicals, and early technocrats. The summer she began writing the novel was infamous, dark, stormy, post-volcanic. The air was thick with doom and innovation. It was the perfect backdrop for imagining artificial life. The coincidence lies in timing. Just as science was beginning to unlock the body's electric language, Shelley wrote a cautionary tale of man playing God. She wasn't reacting to history, she was preempting it. She predicted the moral dilemma of modern bioethics, a century before organ transplants, gene editing, and cloning, and she did it with a ghost story. The result? A novel that still resonates not because it was right, but because it asked the question before the question had fully formed. Can man create life without consequence? The answer, buried in her pages, is still being debated. And while Shelley's monster stumbled through fog and fear, another president would face 2 bullets and a strange coincidence of timing that echoed far beyond his own death. The man who was assassinated twice. William McKinley was assassinated in 1901 by an anarchist with a revolver and a grudge. He was shaking hands at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo when the shots were fired. One of the bullets lodged in his stomach. At first, he seemed to recover. Then infection set in, and the 25th President of the United States died 8 days later. The man who replaced him? Theodore Roosevelt, Vice President, adventurer, and future bear namesake. He stepped into the Oval Office like a whirlwind, as if McKinley's measured calm had to be balanced by Roosevelt's explosive energy. But here's where it gets weird. In 1912, more than a decade after McKinley's death, Roosevelt was running for president again, this time as a third-party candidate. During a campaign stop in Milwaukee, he was shot in the chest by a would-be assassin, and he survived. The bullet was slowed by a folded copy of his speech and a metal glasses case in his breast pocket. Roosevelt, ever the showman, proceeded to give his speech anyway, telling the crowd, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose. 2 presidents, 1 dead, 1 nearly, both tied together not just by succession, but by gunfire. It's a bizarre symmetry. The man who rose because of an assassination nearly fell to one himself on the campaign trail while invoking his rugged image. History loves these mirrors. McKinley's quiet end, Roosevelt's bulletproof bravado. And if presidential bodies can dodge bullets or not, voices too, can carry uncanny echoes, just ask the man who became the vocal cords for 2 of the most famous cartoon characters in history, the voice of Daffy Duck and Porky Pig. Mel Blanc wasn't just a voice actor, he was a vocal shapeshifter. The man of 1,000 voices, he gave life to the Looney Tunes pantheon, Bugs Bunny, Tweety, Yosemite Sam, and 2 of the most iconic stutterers in cartoon history, Daffy Duck and Porky Pig. Now here's the coincidence. He voiced both characters, 2 distinct personalities, 2 wildly different speech patterns. One man, Daffy Duck, manic, lispy, chaotic, a whirlwind of insecurity and bravado. Porky Pig, stammering, anxious, sweet, the eternal underdog. Each voice is so distinct it feels like a separate organism, and yet they emerged from the same throat, shaped by the same larynx, modulated by the same man. This wasn't just talent. It was uncanny duality. Daffy and Porky often appeared in scenes together, arguing, spiraling into slapstick, and Blanc would perform both sides live, in real time. He didn't record each line separately. He switched characters mid-sentence. It's the kind of mastery that borders on eerie, like watching someone argue with himself using 2 personalities so authentic they feel independently sentient. Even stranger? Mel Blanc was once in a coma after a car crash, unresponsive to doctors and family, until one doctor addressed him as Bugs Bunny. Blanc, still unconscious, responded in character. Coincidence? Or did the characters actually live within him, ready to speak before he could? And while Blanc's vocal creations were cartoonish and eternal, another man left his mark on the world with a severed ear and a sanity as fragile as brushstroke. The painter who cut off his ear. Vincent van Gogh didn't just paint, he bled color. And in 1888, during a feverish episode in Arles, France, he famously sliced off part of his left ear. Why? Historians debate. Some say it was after a vicious argument with fellow artist Paul Gauguin. Others claim it was a psychotic break. What's undeniable is that Van Gogh took a blade to his own body, then reportedly wrapped the ear in cloth and delivered it to a local brothel. The act was as dramatic as it was horrifying art turned into auto-mutilation. The coincidence? The timing. Just before his greatest explosion of creativity, his post-ear period produced some of his most iconic works. The Starry Night, Irises, Wheatfield with Crows. As if the severing of flesh unblocked something cosmic. It's a terrifying correlation. The closer he spiraled toward madness, the more transcendent his work became. Pain and beauty, colliding in oils and canvas. The ear wasn't just an injury, it was a symbol. A sacrifice. Proof that genius sometimes leaks from wounds. And here's the darker irony. Van Gogh sold only one painting in his lifetime. He died, broke, depressed, and misunderstood. Today, his works sell for hundreds of millions. His mutilation is whispered like myth. His ear is art history's most famous missing part. Madness, art, coincidence, a triangle no museum can explain. And speaking of repeated endings, what happens when a ruler is said to die on his birthday but didn't? History has a way of remembering wrong and making it stick. The Roman emperor who died on the same day he was born, revisited. Julian the Apostate again? Sort of. This is the Mandela effect in historical armor. Many sources have repeated the tale that Roman Emperor Julian was born and died on the same date, the 26th of June. A poetic full circle. The beginning and the end, neatly synchronized. Another historical Ouroboros. But there's a snag, wasn't? Julian was born on the 6th of November, 331 AD, and died on the 26th of June, 363 AD. Not the same day. Just a case of mistaken dates, maybe misread tomb inscriptions, or misprinted calendars that got passed around until they hardened into fact. So why does this false coincidence persist? Because it feels true. The idea of a ruler, especially one as polarizing and paradoxical as Julian, dying on his birthday has a kind of tragic symmetry that people crave. He was Rome's last pagan emperor, trying to roll back the Christian tide with intellect and incense. A man out of time, swimming against the current of destiny. That kind of character needs a poetic exit. When history doesn't provide one, we make it up. This isn't just a coincidence. It's a shared illusion, a mental placeholder, a myth that survives because it's more emotionally satisfying than the truth. Julian's death wasn't a neat circle, but we prefer it that way. And if memory can manufacture coincidence, real life sometimes delivers it with double billing, like two baby-faced actresses sharing one role and a cultural childhood. The twin actors, Full House. Michelle Tanner had two faces, one smile, two souls. When Full House hit television screens in the late 80s, no one expected the blonde toddler at the center of the family chaos to be portrayed not by one actress, but two, Mary, Kate, and Ashley Olsen. The casting wasn't a gimmick, it was necessity. Labor laws limit how long a child can work on set. Enter identical twins. They alternated scenes, seamlessly, indistinguishably. Audiences didn't know, didn't care. Michelle was Michelle. But as the twins grew, so did the myth. They weren't just co-stars. They became a brand, a mirrored empire of matching clothes, VHS tapes, and tween-targeted merchandise. One character, split between two bodies, growing into two vastly different women under the same spotlight. Here's the coincidence. Michelle Tanner's dual existence foreshadowed the Olsen twins' real-life divergence. One became reclusive. The other leaned into fashion. Their identities, once synchronized, slowly orbited in opposite directions like stars born from the same explosion, destined never to touch again. It started as a trick of convenience and became a case study in split identity. Two people becoming famous as one, then struggling to separate from a character neither fully inhabited alone. And speaking of narrowly escaping the machine of death, how? about an inventor who almost got steamrolled by the very thing he helped build. The inventor and the train accident. George Stephenson, the father of railways, had a knack for steering the future literally. His locomotive designs revolutionized transportation, making speed and steel the new gods of the industrial age. But progress has teeth, and sometimes it bites its creators. In 1830, during the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, grand event meant to showcase the future of mobility struck. One of Stephenson's engines ran over William Huskisson, a British statesman and unfortunate pedestrian. It was the world's first widely reported railway fatality. Stephenson narrowly avoided being a part of that historical footnote himself. Just moments before, he'd been in the path of the same locomotive but was pulled away or diverted, depending on which version you believe. He lived. Huskisson didn't. This proximity to disaster adds a chilling footnote to Stephenson's legacy. He wasn't just an innovator, he was nearly a victim of his own success. Imagine watching your dream realized, only to have it spill blood on its debut. The coincidence isn't just that he dodged death, it's that the first true tragedy of rail transport happened in his presence, on his creation, during its grand unveiling. Progress doesn't always wait for perfection. Sometimes it arrives dressed in smoke and iron and leaves behind a body before the applause has even stopped. And while Stephenson flirted with fate on the tracks, another author would chart a course through time itself, building a machine not of gears and engines, but of fears and futures. The author who wrote about a time machine and the Victorian era. In 1895, H.G. Wells launched a genre with nothing but ink, imagination, and an extraordinary sense of temporal discontent. The Time Machine wasn't the first speculative fiction story about traveling through time, but it was the first to frame time as a landscape, navigable by technology. Not prophecy, not magic, a machine. But here's the strange part. Wells didn't just invent science fiction. As we know, Ive managed to encode the Victorian anxieties of his time with eerie accuracy about the future. The time traveler journeys forward, only to discover a dystopian future populated by the effete, helpless Eloise and the cannibalistic, subterranean Morlocks. It was a grotesque extrapolation of the class system Wells saw growing more vicious and codified in his own time. He wasn't just warning his contemporaries, he was mapping the future. Now here's the coincidence. The book, intended as satire and nightmare, has continued to reflect modern fears with uncomfortable clarity. Industrial exploitation, class division, the erosion of individuality, environmental collapse, all there, dressed in the 19th century's scientific optimism. We keep catching up to his fiction, and that's the unnerving part. Wells's machine may not exist, but his ability to see forward socially, technologically, even morally feels like a kind of time travel. He didn't just imagine how we might move through time, he predicted how we might waste it. And while his machine was powered by intellect and metaphor, another fictional machine, an ugly stainless steel car, would turn 88 miles per hour and explode into pop culture destiny. The Back to the Future car and the speed. When Doc Brown's DeLorean peeled through the parking lot and vanished into 1955, the world's idea of time travel changed forever. No glowing crystals, no spinning rings. Just 1.21 gigawatts of stolen plutonium and a flux capacitor welded into a car that looked like a fridge mated with a spaceship. But the magic number, the specific numerical threshold that turned this clunky vehicle into a time machine, was 88 miles per hour. Why 88? The writers could have chosen anything. Around 100, a biblical 40. But they picked 88, a visually symmetrical number, oddly satisfying, weirdly memorable. And then came the coincidences. 88 has shown up in everything from speedometers to conspiracy theories. Fans began pointing out strange appearances of the number in the trilogy, in cast birthdays, in production trivia. The film became not just a story about causality, it became a magnet for numerical curiosity. Some took it further, noting that 88 on a digital clock mirrors itself, that it's an infinite loop, that it's the visual metaphor of time folding in on itself. Of course, the writers picked it because it sounded right. But good fiction becomes myth when the audience decides it means something. And with Back to the Future, the myth stuck hard. The DeLorean never really worked. It was a commercial failure. But in that filmat that speed it became eternal. And while Doc and Marty chased destiny through years and lightning bolts, one man stared into the void and painted a scream so powerful, it echoed straight through modern anxiety. The artist of the scream and his mental state. In 1893, Edvard Munch captured the sound of existential terror. The scream isn't just a painting, it's a cultural pressure valve. A ghost-faced figure, mouth agape, hands clamped to its head, shrieking silently into a blood-orange sky. It wasn't an abstract, it was autobiographical. Munch suffered from anxiety, depression, hallucinations. His journals recount a moment, while walking with friends, when the sky turned red, the air vibrated, and he felt a great, infinite scream pass through nature. He stopped. His companions kept walking. He stood there, absorbing the terror of the universe. That moment became the painting. Now here's the eerie symmetry. His mental breakdown became a visual language for our breakdowns. Decades before psychology had names for panic attacks and generalized anxiety, Munch painted them. He gave form to the formless. He made neurosis iconic. The coincidence is not that he painted pain. Artists do that. The coincidence is how perfectly his personal torment mapped onto collective experience, as if he tapped into a shared nervous system. The scream has survived wars, theft, memes, and commercialization, but it hasn't lost its power. Because it isn't just about madness. It's about knowing you're the only one hearing the scream, and that the world will keep walking. And if Munch screamed alone, our next figure will sing to the world with a vision of peace that arrived in a year when war and unrest were louder than any melody. The singer who wrote Imagine, and the year of its release. In 1971, John Lennon asked the world to close its eyes and do something unthinkable. Imagine. Imagine no countries, no religion, no possessions, no heaven, no hell. Just people, breathing, being, together. It was utopian, radical, disarming. The kind of song that floats above ideology and drops like a feather onto the soul. But the timing was the strange part. 1971 was a boiling point. The Vietnam War raged. Nixon's paranoia deepened. Bombings, protests, surveillance, and the slow unraveling of trust between people and power. And then came Imagine, a song of such naive beauty that it felt subversive and, for some, infuriating. Lennon wasn't in exile yet, but he was already being watched. The FBI opened a file. America was suspicious of pacifists who preached unity without borders. The coincidence lies in the song's release, a whisper of peace in a year defined by conflict. It didn't match the mood, and yet it became the anthem, not despite the chaos but because of it. And then there's the deeper irony. Lennon, the millionaire icon, preaching detachment from possessions, living in luxury, writing lyrics about letting go. The contradiction wasn't lost on critics or Lennon himself. He later admitted the song was aspirational, not personal. But maybe that's the point. Imagine wasn't a reflection of reality. It was an interruption, a lullaby written during a riot. And as Lennon turned fantasy into a hymn, another man laid down blueprints for a shrine to a murdered leader built by a man born the same year the leader was taken. The man who built the Lincoln Memorial. Henry Bacon isn't a household name, but you've probably seen his work, in textbooks, in films, etched against the Washington sky like a secular temple. He designed the Lincoln Memorial white marble, stoic columns, grandeur modeled after the Parthenon. Here's the twist. Bacon was born in 1866, just 1 year after Abraham Lincoln's assassination. He didn't live during Lincoln's presidency. He never heard the man speak. He didn't mourn him as a contemporary. He was born into the aftermath. And yet, he would spend a decade of his life designing the shrine that would define Lincoln's memory. The memorial opened in 1922. Bacon died the same year. It's as if his entire life arced toward one architectural gesture, to house the memory of a man he never knew. The dates feel scripted. 1 man taken, 1 man born. And decades later, the second builds a home for the first. Coincidence? Or did the national grief that surrounded Bacon's birth leave an invisible fingerprint on his purpose? Designing a memorial is more than aesthetics, it's philosophical. What do you want people to feel when they stand in front of it? Bacon chose reverence, symmetry, weight. Lincoln stares forward, flanked by inscriptions. A man sculpted in judgment and mercy. Bacon didn't resurrect Lincoln, but he gave him marble skin, and somehow the dates fell into place. And speaking of strange echoes between fiction and reality, what are the odds that a young actress playing a brainy wizard would share a surname with another famous fictional genius? The Harry Potter actress and the literary character. Emma Watson was cast as Hermione Granger in the Harry Potter films when she was just 11 years old. Bright, bookish, fiercely articulate, Hermione became a role model for a generation that needed to believe intelligence could be power. But here's the literary curveball. Watson shares a surname with one of literature's other iconic sidekicks, Dr. John H. Watson, Sherlock Holmes' loyal companion and chronicler of mysteries. Now, no one is suggesting familial lineage between characters from Victorian London and the British wizarding world, but the coincidence has a strange weight. Hermione, like Dr. Watson, is the grounding force in a world of chaos. Both are brilliant in their own way zone with spells and strategy, the other with medical logic and battlefield grit. More than that, both characters are defined by their relationships to more erratic geniuses. Hermione balances Harry's impulsive nature. Dr. Watson humanizes Sherlock's sociopathic brilliance. Both give voice to protagonists who might otherwise spiral into abstraction. Emma Watson's own path only intensified the symmetry. As she grew, she became known for activism, intellect, and advocacy roles that mirrored Hermione's evolution. The name Watson became synonymous with both logic and compassion across multiple generations of readers and viewers. Coincidence? Almost certainly, but names carry vibrations. And when 2 iconic characters spanning genres and centuries share a name and a narrative function, it starts to feel like literary reincarnation. And while names can echo across fiction, so too can dinners, especially the last ones. And sometimes, those dinners leave their mark on a wall, in a monastery, where divinity meets experimental failure. The Last Supper and its location. Leonardo da Vinci painted The Last Supper in the late 1490s, during his time in Milan. It wasn't hung in a museum or framed in gold, it was slapped directly onto the wall of a monastery dining hall, the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie. That's the first oddity. A painting of Jesus' final meal with his disciples, a moment pregnant with betrayal and farewell, placed in the very spot where monks ate their beans and bread in silence. Holy drama as dinner backdrop. But that's not the real coincidence. Da Vinci didn't paint The Last Supper using the usual fresco method. He experimented because of course he did. Instead of applying pigment to wet plaster, he painted on dry wall using tempera and oil. Why? To get more detail. To control the scene like a canvas. It looked stunning. For about 5 minutes. Then the wall began to rot. Humidity, mold, poor ventilation, it all conspired against the masterpiece. Within decades, the painting was flaking into oblivion. Ironically, the most iconic image of a final meal was itself slowly dying. Here's the twist. Despite centuries of decay, neglect, war damage, and shoddy restorations, the Last Supper survived. Barely, but it did. A painting of the final goodbye, painted with a doomed technique, hung in a dining hall, forgotten, destroyed, saved. And today, millions visit the crumbling wall to see it. What remains is a ghost Jesus and his apostles locked in their final conversation, suspended on a surface that was never meant to last. But sometimes, the most fragile things endure longest, especially when they're part of a curse, or a story, or a novel involving blood, darkness, and Romanian castles that may or may not exist. The author who wrote Dracula and the Castle. Bram Stoker, a theater manager by trade, gave us one of the most enduring literary villains of all time, Count Dracula. Published in 1897, Dracula bled its way into the collective unconscious with its moody prose, hypnotic aristocrat, and the slow, sinister erosion of sanity. But here's the coincidence that gives literary tourists something to bite on: the castle. In the book, Stoker described Dracula's home as perched high in the Carpathian Mountains, remote and wind-beaten, full of narrow staircases and lurking dread. Many believe he was describing Bran Castle in Romania, real place with real Gothic bones, perched on a cliff in Transylvania. Here's the catch: there's no evidence Stoker ever visited it. He never set foot in Romania, never toured the alleged castle. So how did he describe a location so accurately? Its towers, its positioning, its aura? Some say he based it off travelogues and hearsay. Others claim it's coincidence. But when fiction aligns this well with geography, people start to wonder. Bran Castle became the de facto Dracula's castle. Locals leaned into it. Tourism brochures nodded. The walls echoed with a villain who'd never lived there and a writer who'd never seen it. It's literary parasitism, fiction attaching itself to fact, until fact starts dressing up as fiction. Coincidence? Sure, but the timing, the look, the landscape, it's too perfect. As if Stoker conjured the castle from Gothic intuition, and the world, decades later, went out and found it. And as fiction invaded stone, another composer would write an overture so bombastic it could only commemorate fire, cannons, and the ruin of an emperor who also underestimated Russia. The composer of the 1812 overture and the historical event, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, didn't like the 1812 overture. He called it noisy, vulgar, even insincere. He wrote it quickly, under pressure, to commemorate Russia's victory over Napoleon's invading army. It was patriotic theater, full of literal cannon fire and chimes of victory. But here's the rub. The music may have been bombastic fluff to him, but to history, it became symphonic prophecy. Tchaikovsky composed the overture in 1880. It celebrated events from nearly 70 years earlier, Napoleon's failed 1812 campaign in Russia. But the piece would later be revived, repurposed, and recycled across continents as the anthem of military triumph. Especially in America, where it now inexplicably plays during 4th of July fireworks, despite being a Russian composition celebrating France's defeat. The coincidence lies in the song's perpetual misplacement. A Russian victory march becomes American patriotic background noise. A composer who disliked his own work becomes famous because of it. A celebration of past war becomes a soundtrack for summer BBQs. And then, decades after Tchaikovsky's death, Hitler follows Napoleon's exact footsteps into Russia. Same overconfidence, same disastrous winter. And during that second failure, the 1812 overture finds new relevance reborn as a chilling, ironic echo. Tchaikovsky never lived through either war, but he managed to compose a score that would soundtrack both, unintentionally framing two of Europe's greatest military humiliations. And just like that, history loops repeating its notes, its rhythms, its defeats. All you need is a few cannons and the right tempo. And speaking of music scoring an era, there's a certain couch in Central Perk that never changed, while the world spun into caffeinated sitcom bliss around it. The Friends Coffee Shop. Central Perk wasn't just a set, it was a second home. A fictional cafe with orange couches, brick walls, oversized mugs, and just enough hipster melancholy to predate Starbucks' personality. For 10 seasons of Friends, it was where breakups happened, bands were born, poorly, and group therapy was served with espresso. Here's the coincidence. Friends turned a random set piece into a real-world cultural template. Central Perk became the archetype, the DNA strand, the blueprint for what coffee shops were supposed to feel like: cozy, loud, retro, always open, always with the same 6 people sitting in the same spot. The show didn't intend it. The cafe wasn't even central in early scripts. But as the sitcom gained steam, the shop evolved from background set to character, and then the world followed. After Friends aired, cafes around the globe began mimicking the aesthetic. Not just themed pop-ups, actual businesses. Real chains designed to look like the fake shop on the fake show about 6 fake people drinking fake coffee from a bottomless pot of sitcom magic. This wasn't just fandom, it was behavioral recursion. Art influencing life, which then looped back into art. Tourists now make pilgrimages to see replicas of Central Perk, the furniture, the menu boards, the weirdly clean couches. And somewhere in all that nostalgia lies the irony. The most famous coffee shop in the world never existed. And while Central Perk offered a place for connection, one man reached the top and bottom of the earth hand somehow. Both ends of the planet left him with the same closing year. The man who discovered the South Pole and the man who discovered the North Pole. Death year. Roald Amundsen and Robert Peary were both obsessed with emptiness. Not metaphorically, literally. The voids at the top and bottom of the earth, the places where compasses panic and maps turn to blank whiteness. Peary reached the North Pole in 1909, though the claim remains contested. Amundsen reached the South Pole in 1911, definitively. They were 2 men chasing 2 opposite ends of the same question. How far can we go before the Earth tells us to stop? The coincidence? They both died in 1928. Not years apart, not decades later, the same year. 2 geographical rivals, explorers of extremes, each touching their end as if choreographed by the poles themselves. Their paths never truly intersected. They didn't compete directly, and yet history stitched them together with eerie precision, one at the top, one at the bottom, united not by terrain, but by time. What makes it stranger? Amundsen disappeared on a rescue mission, searching for a downed airship near the Arctic. He vanished. No body, no wreckage. Peary died of illness, quietly. One faded into mystery, one faded into the mundane, yet both gone by the end of 1928. Coincidence or symmetry? It's hard to tell, but it feels like the polis antagonists in the global imagination finally called their explorers home and called them together. And while those men faced the raw force of nature, another author wrestled with something far stranger, the vengeance of a whale. Inspired, not by fantasy, but by the real screams of splintered wood and saltwater death, the author who wrote Moby Dick and the Real Event. Herman Melville's Moby Dick isn't just a novel, it's a myth disguised as a manhunt. Captain Ahab's monomaniacal pursuit of the white whale has become literary shorthand for obsession. But what many readers don't know is that Melville wasn't inventing from thin air. He was reporting through metaphor. In 1820, 31 years before Moby Dick was published, The whaling ship Essex was rammed and sunk by a sperm whale in the Pacific Ocean. It didn't just puncture the hull it targeted it. Eyewitnesses later described the whale as behaving deliberately, violently, unnaturally. The surviving crew drifted for weeks. They starved. They resorted to cannibalism. Some went mad. Few lived. The story became maritime legend, buried in the footnotes of whaling lore until Melville resurrected it, feeding it into his allegorical furnace. The coincidence is how closely Melville's fiction aligns with the Essex, not just thematically, but viscerally. The ocean, the vengeance, the madness. Even the final image, a man adrift, clinging to a coffin. Melville knew the source material, but he twisted it, elevated it, turned it from horror into epic. And then there's the deeper layer. Moby Dick flopped when it was released. Nobody cared. It was long, confusing, philosophical. Only decades later did it become a masterpiece. Just like the Essex, the book was almost lost to history, and yet, like the whale, it refused to sink. Because sometimes, the biggest stories are the ones that the ocean tries to swallow and fails. The two presidents who were cousins, Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt too, names that echo through the American memory like bronze bells. Both presidents, both wartime leaders, both remembered for their teeth-clenched optimism in the face of national crises. And yes, both were related. Fifth cousins, to be precise. Not exactly family reunion close, but enough for a Thanksgiving table somewhere in the ancestral past. Yet what's stranger than the genetic thread is the way history treated them as ideological twins with opposite DNA. Teddy was bombastic, pugnacious, addicted to action. He charged up San Juan Hill and wrestled politics into submission with a mustached growl. Franklin was the quiet revolutionary, operating from a wheelchair, moving entire bureaucracies with careful persuasion and patrician calm. But here's where the coincidence sharpens. Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's wife, was Teddy's niece. Let that sink in. Franklin married into the branch of his family tree where the original Roosevelt dynasty already bloomed. He idolized Teddy, modeled his early political persona on him, then diverged. More subtle, more systemic, more social. The same name, the same bloodline, and yet each Roosevelt reshaped the presidency in his own era. One as a Rough Rider, the other as the father of the New Deal. They bookend the progressive era with unsettling symmetry. Two Roosevelts, both overcoming enormous personal adversity, loss, illness, grief to steer the nation through crises. And while bloodlines can echo across politics, sometimes disaster doesn't need lineage. Sometimes it just needs a blueprint and a sequel that sinks in the same cursed way. The Titanic's sister ship. The Titanic was supposed to be unsinkable. We know how that went. But what's less often remembered is that it had two sisters. The Olympic, which managed a long, mostly uneventful career, and the Britannic, which wasn't so lucky. Built after the Titanic, the Britannic was designed to be even safer. Reinforced bulkheads, lifeboat upgrades. Lessons learned too late for her doomed sibling, just in time for her. Or so they thought. Then came World War I. The Britannic was requisitioned as a hospital ship. In 1916, it struck a mine in the Aegean Sea and sank within 55 minutes faster than the Titanic. 30 people died. It wasn't an iceberg, but the result felt painfully familiar. A luxury ship turned into a coffin by hubris and circumstance. Here's the haunting part. One of the survivors of the Britannic had also survived the Titanic. Violet Jessup, a stewardess and nurse, made it through both disasters. Same family of ships, same woman. Different ocean. The Britannic was never meant to carry passengers in luxury. It never lived up to its design dreams. But it still shared the fate of its sister ship plunging into the deep, proof that steel and planning can only delay, not defeat, tragedy. Two ships, two disasters, one lesson, ignored twice. And if that sounds like a tragic reprise, wait until you hear the most famous rendition of a love song that didn't actually start with the voice that made it immortal. The singer of I Will Always Love You and the song's writer, Whitney Houston, didn't write, I will always love you. But you already knew that, right? Maybe not. The song was originally written and performed by Dolly Parton in 1973 as a tender farewell to her longtime musical partner, Porter Wagoner. A breakup song, but not romantic, professional, respectful. A goodbye wrapped in gratitude. Dolly's version was soft, country, deeply personal. Fast forward to 1992. The Bodyguard hits theaters. Whitney Houston belts out a version of the same song that detonates globally melismatic, towering, earth-shaking. She transformed a gentle goodbye into an eternal torch song. Her voice cracked and soared in places Dolly never dared. Here's the twist. Whitney's version is so overpowering that many people assume it was written for her, or by her. It became her anthem, a vocal Everest that other singers now approach with trembling respect. But Dolly? She cheered from the sidelines and cashed the checks. She retained full publishing rights. Every time the song was played, streamed, covered, used in a movie or on a karaoke night, Dolly got paid. 2 women, 1 song, 2 vastly different interpretations, both equally iconic. One shaped by silence and restraint, the other by power and heartbreak. Both timeless. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe some songs just live multiple lives attached to the voices that need them when they need them most. And if voices can echo across decades, so can face, especially when a painting stares back, then inspires an entire novel to explain the silence behind the eyes. The artist who painted Girl with a Pearl Earring and the novel, Johannes Vermeer painted Girl with a Pearl Earring in the 1660s and then promptly vanished into the amber-lit hush of Dutch art history. He left behind only about 35 paintings each, one luminous, quiet, and eerily still, but none more haunting than her. The girl, turbaned, turning, lips slightly parted, pearl dangling like a drop of moonlight. No background, no name. Just a gaze that refuses to be still. Centuries passed. Museums admired her. Scholars speculated. Was she Vermeer's daughter? A model? A ghost? No one knew. Then, in 1999, Tracy Chevalier wrote a novel that gave the girl a name, a voice, a backstory. Girl with a Pearl Earring. The book imagined her as a servant in Vermeer's house, pulled into his world of color, silence, and forbidden proximity. And here's the coincidence. The novel's narrative, invented from scraps of pigment and possibility, resonated so deeply with audiences that it felt truer than fact. The fiction became the lens through which we now see the painting, as if the story had always been there, hiding in the oils, waiting for someone to whisper it aloud. Vermeer didn't write a single word about her. Chevalier did, and somehow that became enough. Art created a mystery, fiction gave it a heartbeat. And just as this one silent girl found voice across centuries, another film would arrive at precisely the moment history needed eye-tits timing, suspiciously aligned with boots on the ground and bullets in the desert. The film Casablanca, and its timeliness. Casablanca should have been forgettable. It was rushed. The script wasn't finished when filming started. The studio didn't expect much. Even the actors didn't quite know how it would end. But then came December 1942. Just weeks before the film's release, Allied forces landed in North Africa, Casablanca's exact setting. The city transformed overnight from a murky colonial outpost to a headline, a war zone, a symbol. Suddenly, Casablanca wasn't just a movie. It was a mirror. Resistance, sacrifice, loyalty, exilate. all felt ripped from the newspapers, even though it was shot months earlier. The film became prophetic by accident. And it wasn't subtle. Bogart's Rick Blaine was the American everyman torn between love and duty, isolation and action. He ran a nightclub, not a government, but he still had to choose. Just like the US had. Just like millions of viewers were doing every day. Here's looking at you, kid. Wasn't just a lineage, it became a promise whispered into the chaos. That love and principle could somehow coexist. That cynicism could turn, in a heartbeat, into courage. The coincidence is uncanny. The right movie, in the right place, at the exact moment the world needed to believe in nobility. And as Casablanca burned into the screen, a different kind of fire would rise in a German composer's overture that celebrated not a romance, but a thunderous battle among gods and flying women on horseback. The composer of Moonlight Sonata and its inspiration? When people say Moonlight Sonata, they're almost never talking about the actual title. Beethoven named it Piano Sonata No. 14 in C-sharp minor. That's it. No moons, no lakes. Just a key and a mood. The nickname came later, courtesy of a critic who said the first movement reminded him of moonlight on Lake Lucerne. The name stuck, and the music became mythologized as melancholic romances oft, ghostly, sad. But here's the twist. Beethoven never intended that. He composed it in 1801 and dedicated it to a young countess, Giulietta Guicciardi, with whom he was infatuated. The piece isn't a nocturne. It isn't peaceful. It's grief, measured, controlled, then exploding into fury in the third movement. So the moonlight was someone else's metaphor. But that metaphor recast the entire legacy of the piece. Today, it's played at weddings, funerals, breakups, reconciliations, any moment when we need emotion without language. The coincidence is this. Beethoven's personal longing, his unheard confession to a woman he could never have transformed into universal longing. And it did so under a name he never gave it. The sonata's structure was radical for its time. Instead of beginning with speed and ending in reflection, it reversed the formula. It starts like a whisper and ends like a hurricane. Like Beethoven himself starting with love, ending in thunder. And as thunder echoes through the heavens, another young girl would fall down a rabbit hole into a world that would mirror and distort her reality, written for her, but shaped for us. The author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and the real child, Lewis Carroll, was not Lewis Carroll. His real name was Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, a mathematics lecturer at Oxford who moonlighted as the world's most peculiar storyteller. In 1865, he published Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, a surreal journey through a land of riddles, tyrannical playing cards, and chronically late rabbits. But Wonderland wasn't born in isolation. It was built for someone, a real girl, Alice Liddell, the daughter of the Dean of Christ Church, Oxford, where Dodgson taught. He knew her. He told her stories. He rowed her and her sisters down the Thames on summer afternoons and spun spontaneous yarns filled with talking animals and absurd logic. One day, she asked him to write it down. And he did. The coincidence isn't just that the fictional Alice shares a name with the real child. It's how perfectly the tone, rhythm, and irreverent lunacy of the book mirrors what children actually find funny, frightening, and fascinating. Dodgson wasn't just writing for a child, he was writing as if he were one. But as the book became immortal, the real Alice faded. She grew up, married, grew old. Meanwhile, her fictional self never aged, never left the rabbit hole, never stopped falling. So here's the strange symmetry. A mathematician, obsessed with order and logic, writes a masterpiece about nonsense and chaos. And he writes it not for fame or money, but to entertain one specific girl who, in time, becomes a historical footnote to her own fictional self. And as Alice followed white rabbits, Another band in another era would record an album that would become a psychedelic rabbit hole of its own known, that synchronized with a film not meant to be watched in tandem. The band that released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and The Summer of Love. The Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band on May 26, 1967. Days later, The Summer of Love unofficially began. Coincidence? Maybe, but in hindsight, it feels more like a psychedelic prophecy. The album wasn't just a record, it was a manifesto disguised in satin and brass. A concept album before concept album was even a thing. The Beatles shed their mop-top innocence and re-emerged as Technicolor mystics, armed with sitars, circus organs, and lyrics about LSD, reincarnation, and self-liberation. And then the world caught up. San Francisco bloomed in tie-dye. Hippies preached peace. Psychedelics went mainstream. The counterculture exploded. And Sgt. Pepper was already there, waiting, as if it had been left by time travelers to soundtrack the revolution. It's easy to argue causality that the Beatles influenced the movement, but they weren't prophets. They were reacting to the same vibrations, the same disillusionment, the same hunger for something that wasn't capitalism or war. The coincidence lies in the synchronicity, the right music, at the exact moment a generation needed it to explain how they felt. And like all good coincidences, it left behind questions. Did the Beatles spark the Summer of Love? Or did the Summer of Love manifest the Beatles' evolution? Did they change the world? Or just reflect it back with more color? As the flower children danced, another painter was sketching a scene that had no dancing, no color, and no joy, just bombs falling on a small Spanish town, and the ghosts they left behind. The artist who painted Guernica, and the event it depicts. On the 26th of April, 1937, the town of Guernica, in the Basque region of Spain, was bombed by Nazi warplanes supporting Francisco Franco's fascist forces. Civilians died. Buildings crumbled. The air was filled with fire, rubble, and screams. 3 weeks later, Pablo Picasso unveiled Guernica. Let that timeline sink in. In under a month, he processed the event, envisioned its emotional truth, and painted what would become one of the most searing anti-war statements in modern art. Not a photorealistic depiction, not propaganda. Something worsey nightmare. The coincidence here isn't just the speed, it's the foresight. Picasso didn't witness the bombing. He read about it. But what he captured was more than destruction. He painted fear as geometry, death as abstraction, the agony of a horse, the wail of a mother, the blank-eyed horror of an unraveling world. When people saw Guernica, they didn't just see Spain. They saw every war, every village bombed, every child screaming under a falling roof. He painted one event, but it translated into a universal trauma. And like many profound artistic responses, it took time to be recognized for what it was. At first, Guernica was too much, too messy, too modern. But decades later, it stands as a prophetic canvasone, painted before the world had truly processed what total war would look like. And while Picasso turned pain into paint, another actor, this time in a galaxy far, far away, would split himself between two men, one with the body of a villain and the other with the voice of doom. The actor who played Darth Vader's body and voice. Darth Vader is not one man. He never was. He's a Frankenstein of film assembled from separate limbs, voices, and shadows. Physically, he was portrayed by David Prowse, a towering British bodybuilder, but his voice? That came from James Earl Jones, whose deep, thunderous tone carried the kind of gravity that could rupture a galaxy. Here's the coincidence. The most iconic villain in cinematic history had two actors occupying one identity. Prowse, clad in the armor, performed every scene on set. But he was never told that his voice would be replaced in post-production. When the film premiered, it wasn't his voice echoing across the Death Star, it was Jones's, and neither man was ever fully recognized as Vader alone. This duality created a strange afterlife. Prowse spent years attending fan conventions, physically imposing, claiming ownership of a character whose voice betrayed him. Jones, meanwhile, lent only his voice, yet became synonymous with Vader's fearsome presence. The villain is split like Anakin himself, body and spirit at odds. The symmetry is poetic. An actor in black, filmed in the light yet silenced. Another, unseen, speaking from the void. And perhaps the eeriest part, neither Jones nor Prowse saw themselves as stars at the time. They were pieces of something bigger, and that something became myth. Two men, one mask, infinite echoes. And speaking of echoes, another composer once stitched together a myth of gods and doom, where flying women ride to battle through a storm of sound and overture still recognizable from cartoons to cinema. The composer of The Ride of the Valkyries and the opera. Richard Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries begins like a storm, galloping toward U-horns, blaring, percussion, thundering, strings vibrating like an army of wasps. It's not music, it's momentum. It doesn't ask for your attention, it kidnaps it. Written in the mid-19th century, it was part of Die Walküre, the second opera in Wagner's four-part epic, Der Ring des Nibelungen. The piece accompanies the Valkyries' mythological warrior maidens, who sweep dead heroes from the battlefield and carry them to Valhalla. Pretty metal, considering Wagner wrote it 150 years before anyone plugged in a guitar. The coincidence isn't that the music became popular, it's how it became completely divorced from its context. Most people recognize Ride of the Valkyries, not from opera houses but from Apocalypse Now, Bugs Bunny, or any scene where chaos needs a soundtrack. The soaring, triumphant march of divine warrior women has been used to parody, terrify, and energize moments far removed from Norse mythology. It's one of those cultural glitches where the sound outgrows the source. Wagner, a man of grand vision and problematic ideology, accidentally wrote a universal adrenaline trigger. People who have never seen a single opera can hum those notes on instinct. And somewhere in that irony lies the power of music to transcend origin and become a meme of majesty. And while Wagner summoned the fury of gods, another band would strike back not with thunder, but with southern charm, a twangy guitar, and a musical reply that became its own anthem of pride. The band that wrote Sweet Home Alabama and its inspiration. In 1974, Lynyrd Skynyrd released Sweet Home Alabama, a southern fried anthem that sounded like summertime on a porch with a cigarette, a can of something cold, and a lingering grudge. It was catchy, bold, and almost instantly polarizing. Why? Because it wasn't just a song, it was a rebuttal. The band had been listening to Neil Young, songs like Southern Man and Alabama, in which Young cast the South as a land still haunted by racism and repression. Fair critique, but Skynyrd didn't like being painted with a broad brush. So they answered back. Sweet Home Alabama includes a lyrical jab. I hope Neil Young will remember, a Southern man don't need him around anyhow. That line became infamous part diss, part dare, wrapped in a riff you couldn't forget. The irony? The feud wasn't real. Skynyrd and Young respected each other. The song wasn't written out of hate, it was playful, if pointed, but it hit a nerve. It became an anthem for Southern pride, often co-opted for causes far beyond its original intent. And here's the strangest coincidence. While it was a rebuttal, it became a mirror. Both Alabama and Sweet Home Alabama dealt with the same ghost just from opposite porches. The North critiqued. The South responded. Neither side was entirely wrong, neither entirely right. One song's shadow gave birth to another's spotlight. And as cultural retorts go, it's hard to top that unless you're looking at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, where a finger nearly touches God, painted by a man who had no interest in painting at all. The artist who painted, the creation of Adam, and its location. Michelangelo didn't want to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, He was a sculptor muscle and marble were his medium. Brushes, frescoes, that was for someone else, but Pope Julius II insisted. So Michelangelo relented. He climbed the scaffolding, and then he painted the most famous ceiling in human history. The central panel, the creation of Adam, shows God reaching out to touch the limp hand of Adam. Their fingers nearly meet, suspended in that iconic almost touch, power about to be transferred, life about to spark. And here's where coincidence slinks in wearing a chisel. Michelangelo's image has become the visual shorthand for divinity and creation. But what most viewers don't know is where it is. Not in a museum, not protected behind glass. It lives inside the Vatican. On a ceiling. In a chapel that was never meant to be a gallery, but a place of worship. That a reluctant sculptor would paint one of the world's most enduring images of spiritual ignition upside down on his back, fighting mold and plaster poetic enough. But there's more. The shape surrounding God in the painting flowing robes, angelic figures bears an uncanny resemblance to the human brain. Neuroscientists have pointed this out with diagrams and laser pointers. Could Michelangelo have embedded anatomy into theology? Did he see creation as a mental act? We don't know. He never said. But the coincidence sits there, untouched. A sculptor paints life's beginning with anatomy hidden in divine clothing, a ceiling he never wanted to decorate. And while that image soars above, another character a few centuries later would be far more grounded. In fact, stuck in perpetual adolescent awkwardness, surrounded by dinosaurs and sarcasm in a Manhattan coffee shop. The friend's character and his love for dinosaurs. Ross Geller isn't just a paleontologist, he's the paleontologist. The kind who corrects you at dinner parties, lectures his friends about fossils, and makes seduction attempts with trilobite trivia. Played by David Schwimmer, Ross was the designated intellectual in Friends though. The show rarely respected his brain. He loved dinosaurs. He taught paleontology. He even had tenure at NYU. But none of that insulated him from heartbreak, humiliation, or sandwich-related meltdowns. The coincidence is this. A sitcom about romantic foibles and coffeehouse chatter made paleontology culturally relevant. Ross's devotion to extinct reptiles became a running joke and, strangely, an education. Millions learned about sauropods and velociraptors not from textbooks, but from a man who once said, "We were on a break." Ross is the punchline, but also the educator. What are the odds that one of the most popular sitcoms of all time would center a character obsessed with a scientific field that had zero cultural cachet in the 90s? Before Jurassic Park reignited public fascination, there was Ross explaining fossils while everyone else was ordering espresso. And here's the best part. Despite being mocked, Ross never stops loving dinosaurs. Through 3 divorces, through leather pants, through pivoting couches, that devotion never wavers. The joke becomes the heart. And just as Ross gave us science in sitcom form, another Beatle once dreamed a song into being, woke up, played it, and realized he had no idea where it had come from. Just a melody, a dream. A cultural monument disguised as sleep. The musician who wrote Yesterday, and the instrument. Paul McCartney woke up with the tune in his head. It was so complete, so polished. He was sure he must have heard it somewhere. He played it on the piano, humming nonsense lyrics, scrambled eggs, "Oh my baby, how I love your legs," just to hold the melody. But no one recognized it. It wasn't stolen. It was his. That melody became Yesterday, one of the Beatles' most covered songs, a hymn of heartbreak and memory built around simplicity. No drums, no harmonies. Just McCartney, a string quartet, and an acoustic guitar. Except it wasn't written on a guitar, it began on a piano. And despite being a Beatles track, none of the other Beatles played on it. It was a solo effort, wrapped in the band's name, misattributed by history. The coincidence is layered. McCartney dreamed the song, literally. It came to him fully formed, like a transmission. He spent weeks convinced it couldn't be original, it was too good, too clean, and yet no one claimed it. It became one of their most beloved tracks. From nonsense to masterpiece, from dream to permanence, from scrambled eggs to sacred text. Yesterday is about loss, but also about the fleetingness of inspiration, about how the best things sometimes arrive without warning, demanding only that you listen and write them down before they vanish. And if stories can be summoned from sleep, then perhaps it's no surprise that one novelist summoned an entire genre from a village in Colombia where ghosts walked freely and time moved in spirals. The author of 100 Years of Solitude and Magical Realism, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, didn't invent magical realism, but he did give it a pulse. In 1967, he released 100 Years of Solitude, a novel that felt less like it was written and more like it had always existed somewhere in the steam and jungle of Latin America, waiting to be unearthed. It was history, myth, memory, and dream all dancing together in the fictional town of Macondo. The coincidence isn't just the genre he perfected, it's how effortlessly Marquez blurred the line between what was real and what should have been impossible. In 100 Years of Solitude, a girl ascends to heaven while hanging laundry. Ghosts sit at dinner tables. Plagues of insomnia sweep across generations. A man weeps so long that he floods the house. And somehow it all feels normal. Magical realism wasn't about fantasy, it was about the truth dressed in folklore. The bizarre made believable because reality itself, especially in places marked by colonial trauma, dictatorship, and myth, was already surreal. The book became the definitive example of a genre that didn't want to define itself. Marquez drew from family stories, Colombian politics, Catholic mysticism, and Banana Company massacre sand, told it all with a straight face. Here's the eerie symmetry. The book is about the rise and fall of a family, a cycle, generations repeating mistakes, the magical and the mundane indistinguishable. And when the story ends, it ends with the town literally being erased from existence like it never was. A fiction about memory, destined to be remembered forever. And while Marquez conjured the surreal from small-town whispers, another film took a single linear scripted, improvised, and turned it into one of the most bone-chilling declarations ever slammed through a door with an axe. The film, The Shining, and its iconic line. "Here's Johnny." 3 syllables, shouted through splintered wood, Jack Nicholson's face frozen in a maniacal grin. A moment so etched into horror cinema that people who've never seen The Shining still know the line. Except Stanley Kubrick didn't write it. Stephen King didn't write it. No one wrote it. It was improvised. Nicholson, drawing on years of cultural osmosis, pulled the phrase from The Tonight Show, where Ed McMahon would famously announce, "Here's Johnny," every night before Johnny Carson walked on stage. A cheerful, American tradition repurposed for a scene of murderous insanity. The coincidence lies in that subversion. A harmless catchphrase, hijacked into horror. The Shining was already unsettling. The isolation, the time loops, the slow deterioration of Jack Torrance into a violence-soaked ghost of himself. But that one line, playful, familiar, out of context, made everything worse. It was recognizable and wrong. Kubrick kept it. Of course he did. It was too perfect. The line added another layer to a film already steeped in ambiguity and dread. Was Jack possessed? Repeating a cycle? Had he always been there? "Here's Johnny" doesn't answer any of that, but it echoes, like a laugh track in a haunted house. And the beauty of coincidence is that it doesn't need intention. It just lands. A late-night talk show intro, a deranged father with an axe, a doorway between meanings, split open in one unplanned moment. And if that sounds like a wall breaking, wait until a rock band builds a whole album around Unsee's concept album so heavy with isolation, madness, and childhood scars that it practically builds the wall inside your head. The band that released The Wall and the concept album, Pink Floyd's The Wall, 1979, isn't just a concept album, it's a psychological autopsy, scored with thunderous guitars, whispered regrets, and the occasional screaming schoolmaster. It tells the story of Pink, a character who slowly constructs a mental and emotional wall to isolate himself from a world that's failed him. Abandonment, war trauma, fame, alienation, brick by brick, the wall goes up. Here's the structural twist. The wall is circular. It begins mid-sentence and ends with a phrase that finishes the first line. Play it on loop, and the album becomes an Ouroboros snake eating its own narrative tale. Beginning and ending become one. That's no accident. But the coincidence is how listeners often unaware of the structure still report the same thing. The album feels endless, like a spiral of thought you can't escape. It loops in your mind long after the music stops. Each track tells part of Pink's breakdown. Another Brick in the Wall, Part 2, became the hit, an anti-authoritarian anthem with schoolchildren chanting. But the album's true power is its descent though. It gradually strips away the self until there's nothing left but echoes. The Wall is concept made manifest. It's a narrative disguised as music, a breakdown choreographed note by note. And its success? Massive. Worldwide. The album, born of Roger Waters' personal grievances, resonated globally. His own isolation became everyone's... Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe pain just translates well through speakers. And speaking of paintings that echo through time, another American artist once captured an image of silence so iconic, so rigid, that it became a cultural shorthand for an entire nation's psychological posture. The artist of American Gothic and its setting. Grant Wood painted American Gothic in 1930, in the wake of the Great Depression. But the painting doesn't scream despair. It doesn't scream anything. It just erases a farmer, a woman, his daughter, his wife, still debated, standing stone-faced in front of a White House with a distinctive Gothic window. They're not smiling, not even trying. The painting became iconic, not for what it showed, but for how it made people feel. Stoic, worn, proud, resigned, American. Here's where the coincidence pries open the front door. That house, it's real. Located in Eldon, Iowa. A tiny rural town that might have remained anonymous forever except Wood passed through, saw the window, and decided it was perfect for a portrait of fictional hardship. He plucked a background from reality and filled it with faces from his imagination, or rather, from people he knew. The stern man was modeled after his dentist, the woman after his sister. Neither ever lived in the house. The result? A painting that somehow feels documentary, even though it isn't time. It captures something real using ingredients that were entirely made up. It became emblematic of a generation of Americans who endured drought, poverty, and the sense that everything was too hard and yet kept standing. And the building itself? It's still there. People visit it like a shrine to an imaginary memory, a fiction built on fact, a real place inhabited by symbols. That a dentist and a sister could become cultural archetypes is absurd. That a Gothic window could symbolize an entire nation's emotional interior? Stranger still. And while this painting immortalized silence, another character in another animated town would shout nonsense while working at a nuclear power plant, doing the job no one should have trusted him with in the first place. The Simpsons character and his nuclear power plant job. Homer Simpson is many things. A father, a husband, a donut enthusiast, and most terrifyingly a nuclear safety inspector. Let's pause on that. In the sprawling town of Springfield, a man who routinely forgets his own children's names is in charge of preventing nuclear meltdown. He sleeps at his console. He pushes buttons labeled "Do Not Push." He once tried to wedge a sandwich into the mainframe. The coincidence, of course, is that a character, this absurd, this obviously unqualified, would not only survive in his job, but become a symbol of modern work culture. Incompetence turned into stability. He doesn't get fired. He gets promoted. Homer's role as a nuclear technician isn't just comedic irony. It's a perfect reflection of the 20th century workforce, where bureaucratic systems often run not because of competence, but despite it. Where safety protocols are often theoretical. Where mediocrity, wrapped in charm, floats. The show's writers knew exactly what they were doing. Springfield Nuclear Power Plant is a parody of real danger, and yet, in parody, it becomes disturbingly accurate. There's always some news story, some actual scandal involving lax oversight at a real-world power plant that echoes Homer's antics a little too closely. The line between fiction and reality, once again, blurs. Homer, for all his stupidity, is oddly relatable. He wants to provide. He wants to be loved. He just doesn't know what any of the buttons do. And if that's not American, what is? Yet even as Homer fumbles with uranium rods, another voice, soulful, fierce, unmistakably powerful once, reclaimed a song and reshaped history, turning a man's words into a woman's war cry. The singer of Respect and the original artist. In 1965, Otis Redding recorded a song called Respect. It was a plea from a man to his Lavera, soulful demand for appreciation when he came home. Smooth, sincere, a little wounded. 2 years later, Aretha Franklin re-recorded it, and the song never belonged to Otis again. Aretha didn't just cover Respect, she reinvented it, changed the arrangement, added the iconic R-E-S-P-E-C-T spelling hook, backed it with sass, with fire, with ownership. What was once a man's request became a woman's declaration. The coincidence? A song written from a position of male vulnerability became an anthem for civil rights, feminism, and every movement demanding dignity. By flipping the perspective, Aretha transformed a modest track into a cultural explosion. And Otis? He reportedly loved her version. He knew what had happened. "That girl took my song," he said, "and now it's hers." Aretha's Respect became one of the defining tracks of the 20th century. It wasn't just music, it was a manifesto, played at rallies, blasted from car radios, chanted in streets, spelled out in pride. The original was good, but Aretha's? Aretha's was historical. One song, two meanings, two voices. One coincidence that reminds us how perspective changes everything. And while Aretha claimed her throne through rhythm and soul, another French novelist once looked into the bloodied heart of his own nation and stitched a fictional rebellion that reflected a very real one, still smoldering in the streets just outside his window. The author of Les Miserables and the historical context. Victor Hugo's Les Miserables isn't a novel, it's an avalanche in prose, a thunderclap made out of pages. 1,000-page scream about poverty, injustice, love, redemption, and the broken bones of French society. But here's the twist: the rebellion it centers around isn't the French Revolution you think it is. Most assume it's about 1789. The guillotine, Marie Antoinette, the Bastille. Wrong. Les Miserables takes place around the June Rebellion of 1832, a short-lived and often overlooked uprising in Paris. Students built barricades, flags were waved, the poor bled in alleyways. The government crushed it quickly, forgotten by most history books. Except Hugo didn't forget. He lived nearby when it happened. He heard the gunshots. He wandered through the aftermath. Years later, he remembered the blood on the cobblestones and he built a monument to it. A novel that made millions care about a failed revolution they'd never even heard of. The coincidence is that Hugo took a relatively minor event and gave it immortality. Most people today know the June Rebellion not through historical archives, but through Gavroche dying on a barricade, Enjolras shouting about liberty, and Jean Valjean dragging a wounded man through the sewers. Fiction overrode history. And more strangely, the book itself became part of future revolutions. It was banned. It was smuggled. Protesters read it aloud. Les Miserables became a weapon, a moral compass, a coincidence of timing, a memory turned into myth, a writer creating the future by reframing the past. And while Hugo memorialized the fallen, another actor would wear a black cape and a painted smile, terrifying millions not as a hero, but as chaos incarnate, on screen with a man who refused to kill. The actor who played Batman and the Joker in The Dark Knight. In 2008, Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight crashed into cinemas like a moral wrecking ball. It wasn't just a superhero movie. It was a philosophical brawl between order and chaos starring two men who barely spoke to each other outside of their scenes. Christian Bale as Batman, Heath Ledger as the Joker. The coincidence is not their casting. It's not even their performances. It's the sheer, eerie alignment of their arcs on screen and off. Ledger's Joker was unforgettable, unhinged, nihilistic, inexplicably terrifying. He licked his lips, laughed at knives, and made burning money look like meditation. He didn't play a villain. He played entropy with a painted face. And then he died, before the film was released. A few months after filming wrapped, Ledger was found in his apartment, gone from an accidental overdose of prescription meds. The coincidence lies in the line blur. He had gone method for the role of locking himself in a hotel room, keeping a journal in the Joker's voice. The public started asking, did the role kill him? Did he go too far? The answer? Probably not. But the myth stuck. Bale, meanwhile, played the other side. Order, grief, justice tempered by guilt. His Batman never smiled. He was rigid, isolated, desperate to not become what he fought. Two men, one film, a fictional dichotomy that mirrored a real-life tragedy. The Dark Knight remains one of the most critically acclaimed films in the genre, but it also carries weight. Ledger's performance is not just acting, it's legacy. And as Queen's frontman once said, is this the real life? Is this just fantasy? Another track that veered wildly between opera, rock, and eulogy, and became a genre-defying monument to musical contradiction. The band that wrote Bohemian Rhapsody and its structure. Freddie Mercury didn't believe in limits. Genre, structure, expectations, all nonsense. When Queen recorded Bohemian Rhapsody in 1975, they weren't trying to make a hit, they were building a miniature symphony, laced with piano balladry, operatic absurdity, and heavy metal riffs. No chorus, no verse-chorus repeat, just a journey. The coincidence is in the fact that this monstrosity of a song, a 6-minute genre-mashing fever dream with a fake murder and a nonsense word, Scaramouche, became one of the most beloved anthems in music history. Radio stations didn't want to play it. Too long, too weird. But audiences, they devoured it. Here's the accidental brilliance. Bohemian Rhapsody is structured like an opera, but compressed into a rock single. It has multiple acts. It has drama, a trial, a climax, a tragic end. It shouldn't work, but it does. Mercury claimed the lyrics didn't mean anything, just mood and drama, but fans found meaning anyway. Interpretations multiplied. Is it about coming out, guilt, AIDS, death, rebirth? It became a Rorschach song, a mirror held up to the listener. And the coincidence? A track this complex shouldn't be universal, but it is. Across generations, across cultures. A song about nothing somehow saying everything. Freddie never explained it. He didn't need to. And while he painted the sky with falsettos and guitar solos, another man once painted the night itself swirling, luminous, and unhinged with stars that looked like they were about to burst free from the sky. The artist who painted Starry Night and the post-impressionist movement. Vincent van Gogh painted the Starry Night from the window of a French asylum in 1889. He didn't paint it for glory. He didn't even paint it for sale. He painted it because his mind wouldn't stop spinning. And so, he painted the sky exactly how it felt inside his head. Swirls, spirals, explosions of blue and yellow, the stars moving like they were alive, drunk on momentum, a cypress tree like a flame licking the sky, a quiet village beneath it all, unaware. It wasn't realism, it was response. And here's the coincidence. The Starry Night would later become the defining symbol of post-Impressionism, a movement that, at the time, had no name, no leader, and no guarantees. Van Gogh had no idea he was painting one of the most iconic images in Western art history. He thought it was a failure. He sold exactly one painting during his lifetime, not the Starry Night. But the world caught up. After his death, the painting became a symbol not just of artistic brilliance, but of the mental struggle that often shadows genius. The image is so frenetic, so fervid, has been interpreted as everything from divine vision to bipolar hallucination. Perhaps it was both. Post-Impressionism, as a label, arrived after the fact. A convenient box for a style too emotional for Impressionism and too raw for Classicism. Van Gogh didn't fit any mold, so the mold bent around him. And while Van Gogh's stars still swirl across t-shirts and coffee mugs, another sitcom character once adopted a monkey, creating a plotline so bizarre and unnecessary that it actually felt like real life, absurd, inconvenient, and clinging to your shoulder. The Friends episode, where Ross gets a monkey. In the sprawling character arc of Ross Geller, paleontologist, divorcee, passionate about dinosaurs and leather pants, there exists one moment so strangely unnecessary. It wraps around the absurd and comes back as iconic. The monkey. Marcel. Introduced in season 1 of Friends, Marcel was a capuchin monkey Ross adopts because he's lonely. That's the official explanation. The real reason? Sitcoms in the 90s had a weird thing about exotic pets. A monkey was peak random. But here's the coincidence. What began as a short-lived gag became an unforgettable subplot. Marcel doesn't just exist, thrives. He develops quirks. He dances to The Lion Sleeps Tonight. He becomes an international celebrity monkey, eventually landing a role in a fictional action film. Yes, really. The presence of Marcel, an animal sidekick with an actual character arc, somehow feels plausible in the context of Friends. And yet, it's completely unhinged. The writers admitted they introduced him just to shake things up, but the monkey stuck in viewers' minds. And then there's the real twist. Marcel was played by a female monkey named Katie, who became so famous she appeared on talk shows and got more fan mail than most of the cast. Ross's monkey became a real celebrity, a side character with more cultural traction than some recurring human guests. That's the paradox of sitcom reality. Absurdity, when repeated enough times, becomes comfort, familiar, iconic. And just as Marcel faded into the fictional background, another song clawed its way into musical history, an anthem that howled, barked, and shuffled its way from rockabilly oddity into full-blown American legend. The musician who wrote Hound Dog and the iconic performer. Hound Dog didn't start with Elvis. It started with Big Mama Thornton in 1952, a blues belter with a voice like gravel-drenched whiskey. She growled the lyrics. She snarled them. Her version was raw, fierce, uncompromising. A song of defiance aimed at a no-good man. Then Elvis Presley came along. In 1956, he re-recorded the song, sped it up, changed the tone, sanitized the fury, and turned it into rock and roll. His version went supernova. It became one of the best-selling singles of all time. And here's the kicker. Most people think he wrote it. But he didn't. Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller did. two Jewish songwriters in their early 20s, hanging around Los Angeles, writing hits in the weirdest of cultural collisions. The coincidence? A song written by two white kids, first performed by a black blueswoman, then immortalized by a white southern rocker, became a microcosm of American musical fusion. Appropriation? Innovation? Depends on who you ask. But Hound Dog lives at that crossroads. Elvis turned it into entertainment. He wagged his hips on live television and scandalized a nation. But the power of the song, its bark, its bite was already there, waiting. And so, a dog metaphor, born in blues, evolved into a rock anthem, carrying with it the contradictions of fame, race, and history. And as that track reverberated through jukeboxes, another Oxford professor, mild-mannered, ink-stained, obsessed with language, was busy building an entirely different kind of world. One with elves, swords, and languages older than time. The author of The Lord of the Rings and his academic background. J.R.R. Tolkien wasn't just an author. He was a scholar, a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford University, with a passion for philology so intense it could make ancient dictionaries seem romantic. While others saw words as tools, he saw them as bones from lost civilizations. He didn't write fantasy stories to escape reality. He wrote them to reconstruct it. And here's the coincidence. The same man who taught medieval literature by day ended up inventing one of the most beloved, sprawling fantasy universes of all time, one that feels older than the medieval sources he studied. The Lord of the Rings is layered in linguistic precision. Tolkien didn't just name his characters, he built entire languages for them, Quenya, Sindarin, with grammar, phonology, and poetic conventions. He didn't sketch maps as decoration. He crafted geographies with geological logic. It shouldn't have worked. An Oxford professor? Writing about elves and talking trees? That's like finding out your high school Latin teacher moonlights as a dungeon master with a Hollywood deal. But Tolkien's academic obsession with ancient mythologies gave Middle-earth its haunting plausibility. Every mountain, every rune, feels like it belongs. And here's the meta-coincidence. While Tolkien was inspired by Old English epics like Beowulf, his work is now taught alongside them. The line between inspiration and legacy blurred. The student became the canon. So while Tolkien scribbled battle songs in between lectures on Old Norse, another film was redefining the cinematic lens itself, telling a story through shadow, memory, and one final whispered word that no one would ever forget. The film Citizen Kane and the Rosebud Sled. Citizen Kane is what happens when a 25-year-old egomaniac is handed the keys to Hollywood and decides to blow the whole thing up. Orson Welles wrote, directed, and starred in the film, a fictionalized biopic loosely inspired by media tycoon William Randolph Hearst. The film follows Charles Foster Kane's rise and fall, culminating in a final mystery, his dying word, Rosebud. A sled, just a sled. Here's the coincidence. In a film so grand, so architecturally complex in narrative structure and cinematography, the key to understanding the character's soul is a child's Toya memory frozen in time. It's both laughably simple and emotionally devastating. Kane had wealth, power, influence. He could crush industries, build palaces, buy friends. But his final word wasn't about any of that. It was about the last moment he was truly happy before the money, before the ambition, before adulthood hollowed him out. Rosebud was the sled he played with as a child, just before being taken away from his family and thrown into a life of privilege. The irony? Nobody in the film ever figures it out. Only the audience does. The coincidence is layered. A movie about the unknowability of men, told in fragments, ends with a piece of information only the audience understands. The characters remain blind. Wells unintentionally predicted his own myth-making. Like Kane, he rose fast, challenged the establishment, and became trapped by his own image. And while Kane's legacy burned in a furnace along with his sled, Another genius was facing a literal meltdown not in a studio, but in a church dining hall, armed with experimental techniques that would turn immortal art into a fragile ruin. The artist who painted The Last Supper and the method. Leonardo da Vinci didn't like rules. He didn't like routine. And he especially didn't like the way frescoes had to be painted fast, while the plaster was still wet. That was too chaotic, too limiting. So, when commissioned to paint The Last Supper in the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, he decided to experiment. Bad idea. Instead of using traditional fresco techniques, Leonardo painted directly onto dry plaster using oil and tempera, hoping to capture more detail and subtlety. He succeeded in the short term. The result was breathtaking. Christ in the center, calm as a storm brews around him. The apostles in groups of 3, reacting with horror, shock, disbelief to the news of betrayal. But the technique backfired. The paint began to flake within years. Humidity, mold, war, restorations. The Last Supper became one of the most decayed, endangered masterpieces in history. The coincidence? Leonardo, a man obsessed with innovation, inadvertently sabotaged one of his own greatest works. He built flying machines, studied anatomy, designed siege engines, but couldn't stop one of his most famous paintings from slowly disintegrating in front of the world's eyes. Despite all this, the image endured. Reproductions, parodies, copies. The Last Supper is instantly recognizable, even if most people have never seen the original. And here's another twist. The mural captures a moment of divine revelation. One of you will betray me. Painted with mortal fragility. A timeless image, built with temporary tools. And just as Leonardo wrestled with decay, a yellow cartoon boy would sell something even more fragilely his own soul on, a Sunday night television show, using comedy to ask questions that theology usually avoids. The Simpsons episode, where Bart sells his soul. Leave it to a spiky-haired cartoon anarchist to explore one of theology's oldest riddles. Does the soul exist? And if it does, what's it worth? In the episode Bart Sells His Soul, a Season 7 entry in The Simpsons, Bart, ever the skeptic, sells his soul to Milhouse for $5, just a scrap of paper with Bart Simpson's soul scribbled on it. A joke, a dare, a throwaway gag. Except it isn't. Over the next few days, strange things start happening. Automatic doors don't open for Bart. Animals growl at him. He can't laugh at Itchy and Scratchy. He starts to feel hollow, diminished. A glitch in the soul matrix. The coincidence? A primetime animated sitcom, known for burps and pratfalls, stumbled into a metaphysical parable more gripping than most sermons. The episode manages to articulate an ancient anxiety with deadpan humor and haunting accuracy. What if the soul is real, and you sold it for a joke? Milhouse, of course, takes it seriously. He keeps the paper under lock and key. Lisa, ever the moral compass, buys it back for Bart restoring his spiritual balance with a quiet act of grace. And just like that, The Simpsons teaches an entire generation that irony has limits and that some things might matter more than we admit. The episode never answers whether the soul is real. It doesn't have to. The consequences of selling it are real enough. And as Bart clutches the crumpled paper to his chest, relieved, another inventor across history once clutched a device he hoped would save a dying president to realize, too late, that progress sometimes comes with a tragic footnote. The Inventor and the Assassination, Bell and Garfield. Alexander Graham Bell was many things. Teacher of the deaf, telephone pioneer, icon of innovation. But in 1881, he tried to be something else, entirely, something much more urgent. A savior. When President James Garfield was shot by an assassin, the bullet lodged somewhere deep inside his body, but doctors couldn't find it. They probed, they guessed, they made things worse. Garfield lingered for weeks, feverish and in agony. Enter Bell. He had recently developed an early metal detector and experimental device called the induction balance. In theory, it could locate the bullet by reacting to its metallic presence inside the body, a genius move. Timely, innovative, potentially life-saving. But it failed. Here's the tragic coincidence. Bell's invention worked, just not in Garfield's case. Why? Because the president was lying on a metal spring bed frame and the detector picked up interference from the springs. No one realized this. They assumed the machine didn't work. The bullet went unfound. Garfield died. Bell was devastated. So were the doctors. An act of technological hope thwarted by the very materials meant to comfort the patient. The story often gets glossed over in textbooks. Bell is remembered for the telephone, not for the invention that could have rewritten a presidential ending. But in this overlooked moment, we see the cruel alignment of innovation and tragedy. It's one of those eerie little overlaps in history, when invention collides with mortality, and the future fails to arrive fast enough. And as Garfield's life slipped away, unnoticed by machines and medicine, two English kings, centuries apart, would end their reigns on the exact same square of the calendar day of royal death, written twice. The two kings who died on the same day of the month. History has a funny way of echoing itself, not always with fanfare, but sometimes with cold, calendar-bound symmetry. Consider this. King Edward I of England died on the 7th of July, 1307. Exactly 20 years later, to the day, his son, King Edward II, also died on the 7th of July, 1327. Coincidence? A cosmic nod? Or just a grim fluke in royal scheduling? Let's unpack. Edward I was known as Longshanks, a tall and formidable ruler who earned a reputation as a relentless warrior. He conquered Wales, fought Scotland, and reformed English law. When he died on the 7th of July, he left behind a turbulent legacy and a son ill-equipped to handle it. Edward II, in contrast, was a weaker king, more artist than tactician, more indulgent than imperial. His reign was marked by favoritism, rebellion, and an eventual deposition. He lost Scotland at Bannockburn. He lost the nobility's trust. He lost the throne. And then, on the 7th of July, 1327, he lost his life, possibly murdered, possibly allowed to fade in a cold, damp prison. The historical records are vague, but the date is not. Two kings, same name, same bloodline, same crown, same day of death. History books don't often dwell on the date. It feels like trivia, but there's something unsettling about it, isn't there? A father and son, separated by 2 decades, falling on the same square of the calendar as if marked by fate. It reads like a Shakespearean epilogue, the curtain falling not once, but twice on the same stage, on the same cue. And as time marched on, another man, an economist, no less, would try to read the future in numbers. He saw prosperity. He saw permanence. He was wrong, painfully, colossally wrong. The author who predicted the financial crisis. In October of 1929, the stock market exploded in slow motion, not up but down. In a few brutal days, fortunes disintegrated, jobs vanished, and the American dream was repossessed by the banks. It would become known as the Wall Street crash, the spark that set off the Great Depression. But before the smoke, there was a prophecy, and a profit-off, the most ironic kind. Economist Irving Fisher, a Yale professor with a pristine reputation, stood before the American public just days before the crash and said something immortal. Stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. Let's pause. It wasn't just an optimistic outlook. It was the definitive statement of hubris, a man of logic, predicting calm seas in a storm he couldn't see. Within a week, the market collapsed. Not dipped, not staggered. Collapsed. And here lies the coincidence. A man whose entire career was built on forecasting, who believed he was reading the economic tea leaves with scientific precision, accidentally became the author of one of the most infamously wrong statements in financial history. It's not just irony, it's poetic tragedy. His words were printed, reprinted, and stapled to every tale of economic doom that followed. He became a cautionary tale wrapped in credentials. And yet, Fisher wasn't a fraud. He wasn't corrupt. He was brilliant, just catastrophically wrong. That's what makes it sting. History doesn't always punish the wicked. Sometimes it feasts on the overconfident. And as Fisher's reputation disintegrated with the Dow Jones, England's royal family quietly passed on another morbid tradition and soaked in October winds, with monarchs falling like autumn leaves, again and again, on the same cursed date. The unlucky date for English monarchs. The 14th of October. Just a date, a square on the calendar, but in English royal history, it's stained. 3 monarchs, 3 deaths, same day. First, Harold Godwinson. The year was 1066. He was the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. On the 14th of October, he took an arrow to the eye, so the story goes, at the Battle of Hastings, and lost not just the fight but the throne. The Normans took over, and England's monarchy changed forever. Then came Edward VI, son of Henry VIII. A sickly teenager thrust onto a throne built by force and fear. He died on the 14th of October, 1553. His death cleared the way for Mary, known to history somewhat unfairly as Bloody Mary. And then there was Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty, the man who ended the Wars of the Roses. He too died on the 14th of October. Though the year is sometimes misrecorded, it's often conflated with his son. But the shadow remains. The date hangs over English history like an omen. 3 kings, 1 date, centuries apart, all woven into the same thread of mortality. Coincidence? Certainly, but a heavy one. The monarchy, a symbol of stability, disrupted again and again on the same day. It's the kind of fact that makes even historians nervous. What is it about the 14th of October? A harvest curse? A historical magnet? Or just the world's cruelest trivia answer? Whatever it is, it's the kind of pattern that folklore feasts on. And while monarchs were breathing their last under autumn skies, 2 titans of invention, America's dreamers in steel and sparks, breathed their last in the same year, closing the industrial age with a whisper instead of a bang. The 2 inventors who died in the same year. Thomas Edison and Henry Ford. One electrified the world, the other set it rolling. Together, they built the 20th century, or at least the illusion of it, one where light bulbs danced above heads like ideas, and cars roared across landscapes once ruled by hooves and steam. They weren't just inventors. They were myth-makers, icons, the gods of early American industry. And in 1947, they both died. Now, death is inevitable. But the coincidence of these 2 titans who shaped modern life more than most monarchs, popes, or presidents passing in the same year feels like a punctuation mark. A period at the end of an era. Edison died first, in October. His final breath was allegedly captured in a test tube by his Sona, symbolic act, more poetic than scientific, meant to preserve the genius of a man who turned darkness into industry. Whether the story is true is irrelevant. The myth is sealed. Ford followed in April the next year. His Model T had already become a relic. Roads had grown, widened, filled with competitors. But the DNA of his dream-affordable, mass-produced freedom still drove on. They were friends, collaborators, occasional rivals. Ford even restored Edison's Menlo Park laboratory as a museum. they once took road trips together with Harvey Firestone in tow. A trio of egos, camping with phonographs and generators in tow. And then, just like that, the world moved on. Their deaths didn't cause headlines like wars or assassinations, but in hindsight, 1,947 feels like a goodbye, a fade-out. The end of the era when machines were magic and invention felt infinite. And in the vacuum they left behind, pop culture surged in to fill the myth gap with laser swords, golden droids, and the most famous farewell blessing never uttered by a Jedi. The Star Wars quote and its universality. May the Force be with you. 7 words, delivered with the gravitas of a benediction and the mystique of ancient wisdom. Yet it wasn't whispered by a robed monk or etched in stone. It came from a science fiction movie one with laser battles, Muppets, and a golden robot fluent in 6 million forms of communication. Here's the strange coincidence. A line written in the late 1970s, meant to evoke the spiritual weight of the hero's journey, somehow transcended its origin to become a global phrase of encouragement, protection, and cultural shorthand. It escaped the movie. It escaped all movies. It became liturgy. You don't have to be a fan of Star Wars to know it. You don't have to understand the Force, or midi-chlorians, or why Han shot first. You've still probably said it, maybe ironically, maybe sincerely. That's the twist. It functions like a secular prayer, a nod of hope, a wish that something bigger than either of us is watching our backs. Its flexibility is uncanny. It can be solemn, sarcastic, inspirational, corporate, even political. And here's the deeper twist. May the Force be with you isn't a commandment. It's a concession, an acknowledgement that control is an illusion, that the universe is wild, unknowable, but maybe just maybe on your side. It's the last coincidence in our list. The ultimate irony, a scripted line spoken in a fictional galaxy, now floats through real-life conversations with more cultural power than half the texts in modern religious studies. Because in the end, history is shaped not only by wars and treaties, but by phrases that stick, stories that echo, and coincidences that refuse to die quietly. And maybe, if you've made it through all 101 of them, you've noticed something. The world doesn't need an explanation to feel meaningful. It just needs a good story, and a bit of mystery. May the Force be with you.